The 2010s was a hugely transformational time in WWE. Yes, from the decade starting out during the heights of the PG era with John Cena on top of the world, moving on into a time where a whole new crop of superstars would take over, and then on into a brand new era where Roman Reigns and others would dominate the landscape. It's a time that'll never be forgotten, but how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire decade year by year in WWE in the 2010s, a decade in review. 2010 was a huge year in pop culture. In television, The Walking Dead would first hit our screens. In the world of music, Katy Perry topped the charts with songs like California Girls and Teenage Dream. And meanwhile, over in the WWE, names like John Cena and Randy Orton would continue to dominate the ring, all while one of the greatest of all time hung up his boots. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWE in 2010, a year in review. When we last left off, The Undertaker was standing tall as the top dog over on SmackDown, and newcomer Sheamus had just defeated John Cena to win his first WWE title over on Raw. Of course, this didn't come without its share of controversy behind the scenes, however, as with the Irishman being a gym buddy of Triple H's, it led many to wonder if this association hadn't hastened his rise up the card. So looking to prove everyone wrong and show them that he did deserve to be the champ, Sheamus headed into the first pay-per-view of the year, January 31st's Royal Rumble, with a major chip on his shoulder. And in the end, this motivated him enough to defeat his opponent for the night, Randy Orton, though only via means of disqualification. But that wasn't the only belt on the line at the Rumble, because elsewhere, The Undertaker successfully defended the World Heavyweight title against Rey Mysterio, Christian retained the soon-to-be-retired ECW Championship in a match with Ezekiel Jackson, and Mickie James finally got her revenge over LayCool when she took the women's title from Michelle McCool. Then, once all that was over, it was time for the real main event to take place, because in the Rumble itself, 30 men went to war over an opportunity to close out WrestleMania. That said, one man who was more motivated than almost anyone else here was Shawn Michaels, because after challenging The Undertaker to a rematch at the Showcase of the Immortals following their era-defining classic the year prior, he'd be shocked to find out the dead man had turned him down. So feeling like the only way to get back to him was to win the Royal Rumble and subsequently challenge for his World Heavyweight title then, HBK entered at number 18 and made it his mission to remain there until the end. Unfortunately though, on this particular night, such a victory would not be in the cards for him, because after Michaels was eliminated by Batista, it was left to the ultimate opportunist Edge to make a surprise return from injury and win the whole thing. But who would he be facing on the grandest stage? Well, in order to answer that question, we'd first have to shift over to February 21st, as it was there, on the final pit stop along the road to WrestleMania, both world titles would be defended inside of the pay-per-view's titular Elimination Chamber. And on the Raw side of things, this meant Sheamus had to go up against 5 challengers in the form of Triple H, John Cena, Randy Orton, Kofi Kingston, and Ted DiBiase Jr. So perhaps it shouldn't come as a surprise that, in the end, the Irishman was unable to hold on to his belt, with the whole thing eventually being won by Big Match John. Not that he'd have long to celebrate this victory, however, because immediately after the bout was over, Vince McMahon came to the ring to announce that there was one more challenger for the WWE title left that night, and it was none other than Batista. Of course, you don't have to be a genius to guess what happened next then. The Animal defeated the already beaten down champ in short order to win his 6th world title overall. And that wasn't the only title change which would come before the night was over, because while Drew McIntyre and The Miz were able to hold on to their Intercontinental and United States championships respectively, in the second chamber bout, The Undertaker would not be so lucky. But given the fact he was almost burned alive during a pyro accident prior to the match starting, it's a miracle he was able to compete at all. That said, it wasn't this incident which ultimately cost him the victory, because after almost half an hour of sharing the ring with Chris Jericho, Rey Mysterio, CM Punk, John Morrison, and R-Truth, the dead man was ultimately taken out of commission by an interference spot from Shawn Michaels, a move which eventually allowed Y2J to pick up the win. Why had HBK done this? Well, with The Undertaker refusing to answer his challenges, he felt this was the only way he had left to get his attention. And get his attention it most certainly did, because in the weeks following, the Phenom agreed to face Michaels one more time at WrestleMania, though only if he agreed to put his career on the line. So like that, it was all set then. Career versus streak to main event the biggest show of the year. Before we get there though, March 27th saw the newest Hall of Fame class be inducted. And this year, Not only would the lineup be made of past WWE stars such as the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase and Wendy Richter, but also outside legends like Stu Hart, Gorgeous George, and Antonio Inoki. Yes, it was a banner year for the Hall of Fame, and such grandeur would continue to carry on over to the next night as WrestleMania 26 took place live from Glendale, Arizona. But while the big focus here was on the main event, there was a whole show of big-time bouts to come before that, amongst the earliest of which was the collapse of the Legacy. What happened here? Well, following the trio's great work in keeping Randy Orton a part of the world title scene during 2009, Cody Rhodes and Ted DiBiase had decided it was time for them to move out on their own. Of course, they weren't the only ones ready to reach the next level though, because in the following bout, Jack Swagger's rise began when he defeated Christian, Dolph Ziggler, Drew McIntyre, Evan Bourne, Kane, Kofi Kingston, Matt Hardy, MVP, and Shelton Benjamin in the annual Money in the Bank ladder match. Elsewhere though, some other up-and-comers would not be so successful as, not only did Sheamus fail to beat Triple H one-on-one, but CM Punk, someone who had been getting over in a big way on account of the Straight Edge Society stable he'd formed around himself, ultimately got bested by Rey Mysterio. And sure, these results may have shocked some, but they were nothing compared to what came next, as after finally returning to WWE TV the prior January and burying the hatchet with Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart agreed to have one more match, this time with Vince McMahon himself. Unfortunately though, given the incredibly limited nature of what the Hitman could do at this point, the bout which followed is probably best left forgotten. Luckily then, there was plenty still to come after it, with the latter section of the card including not only Chris Jericho successfully defending his World Heavyweight title against Edge, but also John Cena beating Batista to regain the WWE Championship. That said, in the end, all of this was table setting for the real main event, the one which would either see the climax of an iconic streak or the final chapter in a legendary career. So with everything on the line, Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker went at it one more time, with this bout lasting for 24 minutes, and in some people's eyes, actually managing to exceed what the two pulled off the prior year. Whatever your opinion of which was better though, it's hard to argue the ending of this one wasn't the most emotional, as once it was over, it was The Undertaker who was standing tall after taking his streak to 18-0, all while HBK was forced to contend with the fact that his career was finished. Yes, it was a bitter pill for everyone to swallow, knowing there would be no more Shawn on TV. But given how much he'd already given fans at this point, they were more than happy to cheer him off into the sunset during his retirement speech the next night on Raw. Once that was over though, things had to move on, as with the wheel continuing to turn, Jack Swagger shocked the wrestling world on the March 30th episode of SmackDown when he successfully cashed in his Money in the Bank contract on Chris Jericho. And this would set up WWE's return to Baltimore, Maryland for April 25th's Extreme Rules, a show where it was all about the hardcore style as a number of feuds reached the next level, this time under far more intense conditions. But perhaps none of these were more intense than Swagger's first big title defense against Randy Orton here, with this one seeing the champ manage to retain after a hard-fought Extreme Rules match. Others wouldn't fare so well, however, because not only would Michelle McCool lose her newly regained women's title to Beth Phoenix in an Extreme Makeover bout, but in losing to CM Punk, Rey Mysterio failed to force the Second City Saint to shave his head bald. At least John Cena had a better time then, as in the main event of the night, after Sheamus and Edge put their respective feuds against Triple H and Chris Jericho to bed with big-time victories, Big Match John walked into a last man standing match with Batista and ultimately came out the victor. And that would lead us directly into the next pay-per-view of the year then, May 23rd's Over the Limit, as there, Cena had to defend one more time against Batista, this time in an I Quit match. Of course, he'd be able to successfully do so though, come the end, and he wasn't the only champion who managed to successfully defend that night either, as elsewhere, not only did Jack Swagger retain after losing via disqualification to The Big Show, but the Hart Dynasty continued their reign as tag team champions after beating Chris Jericho and The Miz. That said, neither of these would qualify as the most noteworthy moment of the night because prior to this, in their final battle, Rey Mysterio finally got the better of CM Punk and as a result, forced him to cut off his long locks. Not that Punk gave fans the satisfaction of getting to see his newly shaved head, however, at least not for a while, as following Over the Limit, he'd start regularly coming down to the ring every week wearing a full lucha mask. But this wasn't even the biggest story going on at the time, because right as Bret Hart was getting a brief run as United States Champion and Batista was legitimately quitting the company so as to go start a career in Hollywood, an all-new invasion angle began when the Nexus waged war on WWE. Who were the Nexus? Well, they were contestants from Season 1 of NXT, back when it was still in its game show format. So with each of them feeling like they didn't want to wait around for an opportunity to be handed to them, the group, made up as they were of Wade Barrett, David Otunga, Heath Slater, Justin Gabriel, Skip Sheffield, Michael Tarver, Darren Young, and Daniel Bryan, would take matters into their own hands by interrupting the main event of the June 7th episode of Raw. And proving they were not a group to be taken lightly here, they destroy everything in sight, with their wrath not only focusing on the wrestlers, commentators, and announcers who were at ringside, but also the ring itself. Needless to say then, this immediately grabbed the attention of fans everywhere. It made WWE exciting to watch again. Hell, even if Daniel Bryan was fired on night 1 after his choking of Justin Roberts with a tie was deemed too violent, it only made the group feel that much more threatening as a result. So with this threat lingering in the background, every WWE superstar had to develop eyes on the backs of their heads as they moved into the next big show of the year, June 20th's Fatal 4-Way. But given how much of fans' focus was elsewhere for the majority of this show, it's no surprise much of it has since gone forgotten. In fact, aside from seeing Rey Mysterio and Sheamus winning the World Heavyweight and WWE titles respectively in separate 4-way bouts, there's not really much reason to go back and watch this one at all. And there's not much reason to go back and watch July 18th's Money in the Bank either, as with all the focus still being on what the Nexus were doing on weekly TV, this event felt very much like something which just had to be powered through so as to get to the next episode of Raw. And given that we were now in the era of the anonymous general manager over on the Red brand, it just shows how much the invading force had already captured the attention of fans. Of course, that's not to say nothing worthwhile came from the first annual Money in the Bank pay-per-view though, because here, Kane and The Miz each won contracts to earn a shot at the World Heavyweight and WWE title respectively. And in the Big Red Machine's case, he'd actually take advantage of this later the same night when he came out at the end of Rey Mysterio's match with Jack Swagger and beat him for the gold in just 54 seconds. Aside from that though, it would be all about the Nexus, as in the main event between John Cena and Sheamus over the WWE title, the heel group unsurprisingly got involved and ultimately cost Big Match John the victory. So realizing something had to be done about this then, Cena and a group of WWE stalwarts would all band together to challenge the Invaders to a 7-on-7 elimination match at August 15th SummerSlam. And in a big surprise for fans at the time, on the night of the match itself, the group made up of Edge, Chris Jericho, Bret Hart, John Morrison, R-Truth, and Big Match John himself announced their secret 7th member as being none other than a returning Daniel Bryan. Yes, the American Dragon was back and was now firmly on the side of the good guys. That said, the expectation for this one was still that the heels would get the victory come the end, as they really needed it to establish themselves as main event players. Unfortunately though, in what turned out to be the only really notable match on the card, it was Super Cena who came out the victor here after single-handedly overcoming the heel group during the final minutes. But it wasn't just fans who were upset by this complete burial of a result this time. No, Edge and Chris Jericho have both since gone on record too as saying they were against such a finish, as they felt it ultimately did more harm than good. In the end though, Big Match John thought it was best to keep himself looking strong, and so that's what happened. In doing so, however, he effectively cut the legs right out from under the Nexus, meaning they'd never really be taken seriously as a big-time threat again after this. Still, the storyline continued to limp on for a few months yet, with the next big step in it seeing Darren Young be booted from the heel group the following night on Raw. And it would continue to be a major focus of the show as September 19th's Night of Champions rolled around too, because there, in a 6-pack elimination match for the WWE title, Wade Barrett got his first shot at the gold. Prior to this, however, the undercard featured a few other notable moments, the main one of which was Daniel Bryan winning his first title in WWE when he beat his former NXT mentor The Miz for the United States strap. Then after it was revealed that Kane had put his brother in a vegetative state months prior so as to get him out of the title picture on SmackDown, The Undertaker returned to seek his revenge, with the two going at it in a no-holds-barred match. In a surprise to some though, it was the Big Red Machine who actually won this one, retaining his World Heavyweight title in the process. And he wasn't the only one retaining that night, because elsewhere, Michelle McCool, one half of co-women's champions Lay Cool, would defeat Melina to unify the women's and divas titles. In the main event though, it was a different story, as there, after spending just over 21 minutes trying to overcome John Cena, Wade Barrett, Edge, Chris Jericho, and Randy Orton, Sheamus once again lost the WWE title, this time to the Viper. Of course, it wouldn't just be the Irishman's run on top which ended here, though, because after the bout, Y2J would take another sabbatical from WWE so as to spend more time focusing on his band Fozzy. Luckily then, there were others willing to pick up the baton in his absence as, at October 3rd's Hell in a Cell a few weeks later, a number of stars attempted to further establish themselves by taking his place in the main event scene. And none of these were more notable than Wade Barrett as it turned out because, despite the Nexus angle already feeling well and truly dead, he'd managed to get a screwy victory over John Cena. Then, in the main event of the night, Kane and The Undertaker would go at it again, this time inside of Hell in a Cell. But despite the dead man bringing his old manager Paul Bearer back along for the ride here, in the end, it was the Big Red Machine who once again came out the victor after his kayfabe father turned on the Phenom. So, understanding this whole beef had to be settled once and for all, the two brothers agreed to one final blow-off match at October 24th's Bragging Rights. Of course, that wouldn't be the only big story heading into the show, however, as after losing to Wade Barrett at Hell in a Cell, John Cena was forced to join the Nexus along with their two newest recruits, Husky Harris and Michael McGillicuddy. But while most of Cena's time here was spent trying to destroy the faction from within, he'd still have to stand in his leader's corner at Bragging Rights, as there, Wade Barrett got to challenge Randy Orton for the WWE title one-on-one. That said, realizing his newest recruit may screw him if given the chance here, Barrett added a stipulation to this one, where if Big Match John didn't help him win the match, he'd be fired from WWE altogether. Luckily then, Cena figured out a workaround to this when, at the close of the main, he attacked the Nexus leader, causing him to pick up the win, though only via disqualification. And just as the Viper was able to retain, so was Kane, because in what turned out to be not only the final one-on-one bout between the Brothers of Destruction, but also the end of The Undertaker's run as a full-time performer, the Big Red Machine scored the victory during their Buried Alive match, albeit with the help of the Nexus. Why had the heel stable interfered here, though? Well, that was never really made clear. But it has since been suggested that there were plans to have Wade Barrett challenge the Phenom at WrestleMania 27. By the time that show came around, however, Barrett had been reduced to a complete afterthought, and so the company decided to go in a different direction instead. Still, back in the autumn of 2010, there were continued hopes the Nexus could be salvaged, as was evidenced in the fact that the company chose to have Cena and David Otunga team up on the undercard of Bragging Rights to win the tag team titles from Cody Rhodes and Drew McIntyre. That said, as things got closer to November 21st's Survivor Series, it became clearer with each passing day that the angle just wasn't working anymore, and so, in one last gasp to revive it, WWE once again booked Wade Barrett to challenge Randy Orton for the title at this show, with the stipulation here being that Big Match John was acting as the special guest referee. Of course, with him still being an unwilling member of the Nexus at this point, he'd be forced to help his leader get the win, otherwise he'd face being fired. Before we get there, though, the undercard saw Daniel Bryan's rise continue with a submission win over Ted DiBiase Jr., Natalya defeat LayCool in a handicap match to rescue the Divas title from their grasp, and Kane and Edge's war over the World Heavyweight title go to a draw when both competitors pinned each other simultaneously. Then, in the last bout of the night, John Cena refused any attempts Wade Barrett made to cheat his way to victory, with him instead counting the winning pinfall for the Viper once the time came. So with this seeming to mark his exit from WWE, fans were left to wonder just what would happen next. But in the end, very little of consequence occurred. Because without even missing one episode of TV, Cena was reinstated a couple of weeks later when he invaded the arena and continually attacked the members of the Nexus, causing them to threaten mutiny against their leader should he not bow to the face of the company's demands and bring him back. Of course, there was a caveat to all this though, as in bringing back Cena, Barrett demanded a singles match between him and John be booked for the final pay-per-view of the year, December 19th's TLC, Tables, Ladders, and Chairs. Before that event took place though, shockwaves were sent through WWE when, on the November 22nd episode of Raw, The Miz cashed in his Money in the Bank contract on Randy Orton to win the WWE title for the first time. And following another trip over to Iraq for a tribute to the Troops show, this would lead us right into Tables, Ladders, and Chairs, as there, the new champ managed to weasel his way out with the belt still around his waist after defeating the Viper in a tables match. Elsewhere though, the World Heavyweight Champion wouldn't be so lucky because, despite giving it his all in a fatal 4-way TLC match pitting him against Edge, Rey Mysterio, and Alberto Del Rio, Kane ended up losing his belt to the Rated R Superstar. Then, after that was done, the main event saw the Nexus finally be put out to pasture when, following his victory over Wade Barrett in a chairs bout, John Cena quite literally buried the Englishman under a mountain of steel. Yes, it was a sad finale for a storyline which should have been an era-defining one for the company. Thank God the bad times were just about over then, because over the next 12 months, a new superstar was able to rise and breathe life into WWE once more by asking one simple question. Do I have everyone's attention now? 2011 was a huge year in pop culture. In television, Game of Thrones would first hit our screens. In the world of music, Adele was topping the charts with her hit song Rolling in the Deep. And in wrestling, it would be a banner year for other reasons, mostly on account of the rise of one superstar in particular. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWE in 2011, a year in review. When we last left off, Edge was the World Heavyweight Champion over on SmackDown, The Miz had recently won the WWE title on Raw, and the Nexus experiment had crashed and burned. So, hoping to move on from the whole debacle then, the company put their best foot forward for the first big pay-per-view of the year on January 30th, the Royal Rumble. But what separated this Rumble from past events was that, for the first time ever, rather than the titular match being made up of 30 men, it would now host 40 superstars, each battling for a main event spot at WrestleMania. And if you were wondering whether this was too much of a good thing, you'd be right, because in the end, the whole thing turned into a bit of a mess, albeit one which wasn't without a few highlights, such as an early period of domination from both CM Punk and Daniel Bryan. Once it was all over though, it would be neither of these men who were standing tall as the winner. No, that honor was saved for relative newcomer Alberto Del Rio after he last eliminated Santino Marella. Of course, this wasn't the only big moment on the show, however, because elsewhere, Eve Torres was overcoming Lay Cool and Natalya to become the new Divas champion, The Miz was successfully defending his WWE title against Randy Orton, and Edge managed to get the better of Dolph Ziggler so as to retain the World Heavyweight title. That said, in order to do so, he had to use his spear finisher, something which had been banned by SmackDown general manager Vicky Guerrero prior to the bout. So this would lead to Vicky stripping the Rated R superstar of the belt on the February 18th episode of the Blue Brand, and from there, awarding it to the Show-Off instead. Luckily though, this would also be the same night where Teddy Long returned to take back his job from the usurper, and from there, give Edge a one-on-one rematch for the title, playa. And after that was done, it would be the Canadian who once again stood tall as the champ, with him continuing to carry this belt with pride as WWE moved in Elimination Chamber just 2 days later. However, he'd have a tough challenge to contend with because inside of the titular chamber, he'd be forced to defend against Rey Mysterio, Kane, Drew McIntyre, The Big Show, and Wade Barrett. But despite this, in the end the champ was able to retain, with him using all of his guile and wits to do so. And the same could be said for The Miz too, because while he didn't have to face off against 5 challengers that night, he did have to go one-on-one with Jerry the King Lawler. Of course, Lawler may have been a bit longer in the tooth at this point, but that didn't stop him from coming close to winning the belt at a couple of points, only for the heel champ to eventually outsmart him and walk away still on top of the mountain. But by the end of the night, his main concern would be staying on top at WrestleMania because, following his successful defense here, another Elimination Chamber match took place featuring John Cena, CM Punk, Randy Orton, Sheamus, John Morrison, and R-Truth, with the winner of this getting a shot at the WWE title at the biggest show of the year. So, who would win? Who else but Big Match John himself, as with Alberto Del Rio staking his claim at Edge over on SmackDown, the 2 big title bouts were now set in stone. Before we'd get to them though, a major shockwave was sent through the industry when, after The Rock returned to WWE for the first time in almost a decade to announce he was going to be the guest host of WrestleMania 27, he'd continue to appear on Raw week in and week out in order to get in the face of John Cena. Yes, it appeared the 2 megastars had taken a legitimate disliking to one another after some comments John made about Rocky's dedication to the industry upset the People's Champion. So during this, they built up their beef over the weeks which followed, teasing an eventual showdown between them. Unfortunately though, that left the actual champion, The Miz, feeling like so much of an afterthought, you'd have been forgiven for forgetting he was Cena's actual upcoming opponent. Still, it was what it was, and with Mania drawing ever nearer, the company felt like using The Rock as much as possible would guarantee them the biggest buy rate. Would this work though? Well, we'd find out on April 3rd. But before that, the newest Hall of Fame class was inducted on April 2nd, when big names such as the Road Warriors, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, and headliner Shawn Michaels all got their rings. Then once that was done, it was time for the showcase of the Immortals to begin with a bang when Edge successfully defended the World Heavyweight title against Royal Rumble winner Alberto Del Rio. That said, this wasn't originally supposed to be the opener. No, that was supposed to be Daniel Bryan vs. Sheamus, but due to time constraints, the United States title ended up getting bumped to the pre-show, a decision which started off a major chain of events we'll return to in a few years' time. Moving back to the main show for now though, undashing Cody Rhodes was up next, as he got his first big WrestleMania singles moment by picking up a win over Rey Mysterio. And after that was over, CM Punk, someone who had by then dropped the Straight Edge Society in favor of leading the new Nexus instead, challenged Randy Orton in a losing effort. Sadly, however, from this point on it would be mostly downhill, as in a match which took up almost 24 minutes on a WrestleMania card, Michael Cole defeated Jerry the King Lawler with Stone Cold Steve Austin acting as the special guest referee. Then, in an arguably even worse moment, reality TV star Snooki got a prominent spot on the show when she teamed with John Morrison and Trish Stratus to defeat Dolph Ziggler and LayCool. Yes, there's a reason this one is considered one of the weakest Manias ever by many people, and it's because of moments like those. That said, it wasn't as if everything was bad, because up after that would be the next in a line of Undertaker classics when he put his streak on the line against Triple H. Why Triple H? Well, following the dead man's retirement of Shawn Michaels the prior year, the Game wanted revenge for his fallen friend. And in this match, he'd take The Undertaker to places he'd never been before. So much so that despite coming out the winner and raising his streak to 19-0 after grabbing a lucky submission hold at the end, the Phenom would have to be helped out of the arena while Triple H walked out on his own 2 feet. That's right, by now the story was starting to shift to the idea that Mark Calloway was beginning to wear down after each successive year. But while this would be picked up again the next year, for the time being, it was all about the main event where John Cena challenged The Miz for the WWE title. And while everyone expected Cena to win this one, in the end things would conclude in a double countout. That was until The Rock got involved, of course, and used his powers as guest host to restart the match. Before he did though, he delivered a rock bottom to Big Match John, allowing the champ to retain immediately thereafter. And so, the following night on Raw then, Rock and Cena met in the ring once more, with them here making the decision to settle things once and for all at WrestleMania 28 in April of 2012. But while many fans thought it was a curious choice to book the WrestleMania main event 1 year out, it wasn't the big story come the end of this month, because on the April 11th episode of Raw, following his title defense against Alberto Del Rio a week prior, Edge came out to the ring to announce that, due to a spinal stenosis diagnosis, he'd be forced to retire with immediate effect. And while this shocked and devastated fans everywhere, it also left the status of the World Heavyweight title in the air, because with the champ now being unable to defend it, a new one would have to be crowned. Of course, this happened at the next pay-per-view of the year, May 1st's Extreme Rules, as there, Christian defeated Alberto Del Rio in a ladder match to finally realize a lifelong dream of reaching the top. And that wasn't the only big title change here either, because in the WWE title match, John Cena finally got the better of The Miz to start his 10th reign as world champion. But Cena's troubles weren't over yet, because later that month at May 22nd's Over the Limit, The Miz got his rematch, with this one being held under I Quit rules. Meanwhile, over on the SmackDown side of things, the World Heavyweight title scene was far more convoluted, as after Christian won the belt, Vince McMahon apparently soured on him and had Randy Orton dethrone him on the May 6th episode of SmackDown less than a week later. And at this point, rather than portray Captain Charisma as an underdog babyface looking to get his title back, WWE decided to turn him heel and have him continually beg the Viper for one more match. Then, to make matters worse, when he finally got this rematch at Over the Limit, he'd be unable to get the job done, as Orton hit him with an RKO to score the pinfall after just under 17 minutes. Yes, we weren't quite out of the dark days yet, as evidenced by the fact that, aside from Cena ultimately retaining his WWE title here, the rest of the card saw the likes of Tag Team Champions The Big Show and Kane defend against the new Nexus' CM Punk and Mason Ryan, Ezekiel Jackson win the Intercontinental strap from Wade Barrett, and Michael Cole and Jerry Lawler fight it out again in a Kiss My Foot match. Maybe then fans hoped June 19th's Capital Punishment would be better. Unfortunately though, this event also wasn't up to much, as with the most notable moments on the card being The Miz and his former protege Alex Riley coming to blows, Christian losing to Randy Orton again, and R-Truth's brief main event singles run ending with him losing to John Cena, there just wasn't that much to talk about. No, what WWE needed was something big to snap it out of its lengthy period of creative stagnation, and luckily this very thing was just around the corner. It started on the June 20th episode of Raw. That was when CM Punk, who was by now the new #1 contender to John Cena's WWE title, ran out during the champ's match against R-Truth to cost him the victory, all before then sitting down cross-legged at the top of the aisle and delivering a blistering promo which shattered the fourth wall and aired every grievance he had with the company. And during the course of this promo, he'd also let it be known that his contract was legitimately running out on July 17th. The very night of Money in the Bank, and that on this night, he'd be beating John for the title, then leaving WWE with it in tow. Of course, immediately following Punk's now famous pipe bomb, the internet was ablaze as to whether or not what they'd seen was real. But while it later did come to light it had been planned, it was also true he was intending to leave when his contract ran out, and that every negative thing he'd said about the company during that promo represented his reasons behind this. So, heading into Money in the Bank, lapsed fans all over the world suddenly found themselves being drawn back in as, in front of his home city of Chicago, the voice of the voiceless was expected to be treated like the second coming of Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, even if Vince McMahon still saw him as the heel in this situation, it was clear the fans disagreed, and that, because of Punk, for the first time in almost a decade, wrestling felt truly exciting again. And it was made even more exciting by the fact that as the show went on the air on July 17th, it remained unclear as to whether or not the challenger had signed a new contract in reality. So the question became, was he leaving, or was this just an elaborate angle where he'd win the belt then appear to flee with it, just as he had done in Ring of Honor years prior? Before we'd find out the answer to this though, arguably the best pay-per-view WWE had put on since SummerSlam 2002 kicked off with the SmackDown Money in the Bank ladder match, which saw Daniel Bryan score the victory over Cody Rhodes, Heath Slater, Justin Gabriel, Kane, Sin Cara, Sheamus, and Wade Barrett to earn a shot at the World Heavyweight title at a time of his choosing. Then after all that, on the Raw side of things, Alberto Del Rio did the same for the WWE title when he defeated The Miz, Alex Riley, Evan Bourne, Kofi Kingston, Jack Swagger, R-Truth, and Rey Mysterio. And as if this wasn't a big enough deal for the fans in attendance, prior to the main event, Christian would regain the World Heavyweight title when, in truly heelish fashion, he got Randy Orton to disqualify himself and subsequently drop the belt to him as per the terms of a pre-match stipulation. But really this was all table setting for the big moment of the night, because once that was over, CM Punk came out to the ring to a messianic response. After that, a battle for the very fate of the company took place over the next 33 minutes, during which time even Vince McMahon and John Laurinaitis appeared at ringside so as to try and ensure Cena came out the winner. In the end though, it was Punk who got the win to a massive ovation. And when the boss got on a headset and demanded Alberto Del Rio come out to cash in his Money in the Bank contract immediately thereafter, he'd eat a quick kick to the head from the new champion before Punk then blew a kiss to Vince and left through the crowd. Truly, it was perfect. Had it carried on in the same manner then, it very well could have been the start of a third boom period for the industry, one which would have seen a new anti-hero stand at the forefront. Ultimately, though, it all began to fall apart soon thereafter, as once a new WWE champion was crowned in the form of Rey Mysterio on the July 25th episode of Raw, he'd immediately put his belt on the line against John Cena, only for Cena to subsequently defeat him and start his 11th reign on top. Then following that, just 3 weeks after he'd left forever, CM Punk returned to the sounds of Cult of Personality to announce he'd now signed a new contract and would be challenging Big Match John to see who the real top guy was going forward. Yes, rather than let Punk run around the indies for months claiming to be the real champion and selling the whole angle as being legitimate, WWE pushed through things quickly in order to get a big pay-per-view match at SummerSlam. And sure, while in hindsight you could argue Cena versus Mysterio for the title would have been big enough, Vince McMahon evidently saw things differently at the time. So it was then that on August 14th, at the biggest show of the summer, Punk got the win over Cena, only to then be immediately attacked by Kevin Nash and lose the WWE title to a Money in the Bank cash-in from Alberto Del Rio. And that wasn't the only disappointing thing about this show either, because prior to the main event, in an otherwise pretty forgettable show and a huge come down from the month before, the only really other notable moment was Christian once again losing the World Heavyweight title to Randy Orton. Still, at least it wasn't all bad, because on the August 29th episode of Raw, WWE mercifully ended the brand split when they announced that, from there on in, Raw and SmackDown rosters would be blended permanently. But that did little to keep the lapsed fans from continuing to tune in, though, because with it now becoming apparent that the Summer of Punk was quickly devolving into a feud between Punk, Kevin Nash, and new on-screen COO Triple H, it all started to feel a little less Steve Austin in 1998, and a little more Diesel in 1995. Yes, at September 18th's Night of Champions, rather than being in the WWE title scene, the voice of the voiceless was losing clean to Triple H. And meanwhile, as this was happening, it would be John Cena who ultimately defeated Del Rio to start his 12th reign as champion. But that wasn't the only big title change at this show, because despite the World Heavyweight title now effectively being relegated to mid-card status following the end of the brand split, Mark Henry's House of Pain gimmick got him over enough to the point where he would dethrone Randy Orton for this belt here. And proving he deserved the spot, he'd successfully defend it during the rematch against the Viper at October 2nd's Hell in a Cell, in a bout which took place inside of the titular cage. Of course, that wasn't the only cell match of the night though, because after Cody Rhodes defended his recently won Intercontinental title against John Morrison in a winning effort, a triple threat bout took place which saw John Cena, Alberto Del Rio, and CM Punk battle it out inside the cage over the WWE title. Even on this night though, Punk still wouldn't get his win back. No, by the end of the show, the focus would be on R-Truth and The Miz instead. Two people who, angry at their lack of time and attention on TV, invaded the cell after Del Rio scored the victory and brought the show to a standstill. And following this, the Awesome Truth became arguably a bigger deal than Punk for a while, as over the next few weeks, they continued to make life a living hell for Triple H and everyone else in management. So, leading into October 23rd's Vengeance then, the Game booked himself in a tag team bout against the heel duo. And in a moment which only further neutered CM Punk, the once rebellious anti-hero would be reduced to partnering up with the Boss here. That's right, it was a far cry from where he should have been, and one which was made all the worse by the fact the Second City Saint ate the losing pinfall too. Thank God Survivor Series would see the company showing signs of improvement once more when that came around on November 20th then, as there, in a moment which should have happened months prior, Punk finally got to go one-on-one with Alberto Del Rio and defeat him to start what ended up being a 434-day run with the WWE title. That said, by now, much of the magic from the Summer of Punk had dissipated, and so the moment didn't feel as big as it should have, but at least what came after it felt like a big deal, because in a tune-up bout heading into his WrestleMania 28 encounter with John Cena, The Rock wrestled his first match since 2004 when he teamed up with Big Match John to finally put an end to the Awesome Truth once and for all. And this turned out to be a major success for WWE financially, as there was still enough interest in seeing the Great One return to action so as to keep a healthy fan base watching. It's just a shame Vince McMahon couldn't capitalize on this with the last pay-per-view of the year then, because following another Tribute to the Troops show on December 11th, WWE headed over to Baltimore for December 18th's TLC, Tables, Ladders, and Chairs. And well, at least one notable moment happened here when Daniel Bryan successfully cashed in his Money in the Bank contract on a prone Big Show to win the World Heavyweight title. The rest of the card was pretty lackluster. So lackluster was it, in fact, aside from CM Punk retaining the WWE title against both Alberto Del Rio and The Miz in a triple threat TLC match, the only other real points worthy of mention were Cody Rhodes beating Booker T to keep the Intercontinental title around his waist, and Triple H and Kevin Nash stinking out the joint in a sledgehammer ladder match. Still, there were positives heading into the new year anyway, as with CM Punk now finally the established champion, and The Rock preparing himself for a WrestleMania showdown with John Cena, big things were on the horizon. Of course, even the most optimistic of fans could never have guessed at that time that one of those big things would be the return of a former WWE Undisputed Champion and UFC Heavyweight Champion who was bringing the pain along with him all over again. 2012 was a huge year in pop culture. In film, The Dark Knight Rises hit theaters. In music, Flo Rida was topping the charts with songs like Wild Ones, Good Feeling, and Whistle. Meanwhile, though, in WWE, it was all about the conflict between the old and the new, as well some newer stars were trying to establish themselves as the face of the new generation. A few older names from the past were making their return and staking their claim to still being top star of the promotion. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in WWE in 2012, a year in review. When we last left off, things were looking brighter than they had been in years for WWE. Sure, the summer of Punk hadn't gone perfectly, but come the end of 2011, the voice of the voiceless was WWE Champion. And on top of that, the rest of the gold in the company was being held by Daniel Bryan, Cody Rhodes, Zack Ryder, Beth Phoenix, Evan Bourne, and Kofi Kingston, with this being what gave us that now famous picture, all of them together with their belts. Not that this situation will last for long though, because on the January 16th episode of Raw, Ryder lost his United States title to Jack Swagger. And that would lead us into the first big pay-per-view of the year, the Royal Rumble on January 29th, where the new champ would enter the Rumble itself and attempt to book himself a spot in the main event of WrestleMania. Before we'd get there though, the undercard saw Daniel Bryan survive a triple threat steel cage match against Mark Henry in the Big Show to retain his World Heavyweight title, CM Punk defend the WWE title against Dolph Ziggler, and John Cena and Kane go at it after the Big Red Machine had spent the weeks prior trying to get Big Match John to embrace the hate and turn heel. Of course, despite helping to bury his friend Zack Ryder when he stole his girlfriend, Cena didn't turn full heel in the end, but that didn't mean he won this one either, because once it was all said and done, it would go to a double countout. Still, at least the Rumble would end more definitively, as there, following Kofi Kingston giving us the first iteration of his soon-to-be annual save spot, Chris Jericho surprised everyone by making his return as the number 29 entrant. And after dominating the bout during its final minutes, he'd come perilously close to winning, only for him to slip on a banana peel at the end and be eliminated by Sheamus. So, with the Irishman now booking himself a title shot at the Showcase of the Immortals, the only question left was, who would he choose? And luckily for him, his choice was made easy by the fact that the very man he was meant to wrestle on the main show the year prior now held the World Heavyweight title. But before WrestleMania came, there'd be another pit stop on the road towards it, and this took place on February 19th when WWE held Elimination Chamber in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. What was the big story going into this one? Well, that would be Kane's continued attempts to get in the head of John Cena and have him turn heel. So after failing to achieve this the prior month, here, the Big Red Machine faced off against the West Newbury native in an ambulance match, all in the hopes that it would draw out his darker side. But John couldn't turn heel now. No, he had a showdown with The Rock the following month to worry about. So after getting the better of his opponent and ending their feud, the franchise player set his sights on preparing for the Great One. And that wasn't the only WrestleMania program which was finalized on this show either, because after defending their WWE and World Heavyweight titles in separate Elimination Chamber matches, CM Punk and Daniel Bryan both accepted the challenges of Chris Jericho and Sheamus respectively. That said, before these bouts would come, there was still one more thing to deal with, as on March 31st, the new Hall of Fame class was inducted, with this class featuring nothing but notable figures such as Yokozuna, Ron Simmons, Mil Mascaras, the Four Horsemen, Mike Tyson, and Edge. Then, once the rings were all handed out and everyone had a chance to celebrate, it was finally time for the biggest show of the year, as the very next night, WrestleMania 28 took place to an all-time pay-per-view buy rate for the company. And why was it so big? Well, because after a year of teasing, this was finally going to be the return of The Rock to singles action. But prior to this, the undercard would also feature some memorable moments too, as the Big Show won the Intercontinental title from Cody Rhodes, Raw and SmackDown general managers John Laurinaitis and Teddy Long used teams of surrogates to go at it in a 12-man tag, and CM Punk successfully defended the WWE title after tapping out Chris Jericho. Of course, all of these matches paled in comparison to the end of an era bout between The Undertaker and Triple H though, as there, inside Hell in a Cell, the two went at it one more time, this time with Shawn Michaels acting as the special guest referee. So with this closing out a 4-year-long mini-story and representing the toughest challenge the Dead Man had faced yet, it was all on the line for the streak. And at one point, after getting hit by a sweet chin music pedigree combo, everyone, both in the arena and watching at TV, bit on one of the greatest ever near falls, as for a moment, it looked like it was finally over. In the end though, it was The Undertaker who came out the victor to take his record to 20-0. and as all three men embraced each other on the stage afterwards, it felt to many like the moment the Phenom could have called it a day and hung up his boots, because it was hard to imagine him ever topping this. Needless to say then, that left a tall task for the main event, as after a year of build, John Cena and The Rock finally went one-on-one in what was being billed as once in a lifetime, and the formal passing of the torch from the prior generation to the next. So that's why it came as such a surprise then when, once it was over, it was the Great One who was standing tall as the winner. Yes, it seemed the torch wasn't going to be passed quite yet, and as a result of this, Big Match John spent the rest of the year kayfabe spiraling as he tried to recover from such a defeat. But of course that wasn't the only big moment which had huge lingering effects following WrestleMania, because, rewinding back to the opener for a second, after having been cheated out of the bout the prior year, fans were left upset when Daniel Bryan lost the World Heavyweight title to Sheamus in just 18 seconds after the American Dragon's on-screen girlfriend AJ Lee distracted him with a kiss. And this meant that the next night on Raw, in protest of the booking decision, the live crowd drowned out most of the show with a tsunami of yes chants. That said, one thing which did get them back into things was John Cena coming out at the close of the show, and, before he was able to challenge The Rock to a rematch, being interrupted by a returning Brock Lesnar. That's right, after conquering the world of MMA, Lesnar had come back. And now, with him having an aura unlike any other as a legit UFC World Champion, the story felt simple. Have him run through everyone for a long time until eventually someone was able to beat him. Apparently no one told this to Vince McMahon though, because at the next pay-per-view of the year, Extreme Rules on April 29th, Lesnar and Cena would go one-on-one in an excellent Extreme Rules bout, which was only marred by the decision to have Big Match John come out the winner in the end. Yes, in one fell swoop, this had killed much of Brock's aura, and also undermined the story of Cena having his worst year ever. Still, at least the rest of the show was better, as elsewhere, Cody Rhodes regained the Intercontinental title from the Big Show in a tables match, Ryback's rise started to gain steam with a handicap win over jobber duo Aaron Relic and Jay Hatton, and CM Punk successfully defended the WWE title during his Chicago street fight against Chris Jericho. But none of this mattered to Brock Lesnar, of course. So still angered at how things had gone for him in the main event, the next night on Raw, he'd kayfabe break the arm of on-screen COO Triple H and get himself suspended as a result. And with the game being gone for a while now too, it left John Laurinaitis as the only on-screen authority figure left over on the Red brand. So perhaps it should come as no surprise then at this point he began setting his sights on John Cena, a decision which led to the two facing off at the next pay-per-view of the year on May 20th, Over the Limit. Of course, this was one of the most maligned pay-per-view main events in WWE history. And to make matters worse, after it was all over, Johnny Ace was the one picking up the victory. Maybe WWE would have been better served focusing his attentions on his world champion instead then, because prior to that on the card, CM Punk was having another stellar title defense, this time against his former Ring of Honor cohort, Daniel Bryan. That's right, despite still being a heel, the Yes Movement was starting to pick up so much steam that Bryan was given the #1 contendership spot here. And while he didn't win, the bout the two put on was fantastic, with fans cheering it on. So, seeing the success of this with the live crowd, WWE decided to book the rematch the following month at June 17th's No Way Out. This said, this time a third party would be added to things so as to throw a spanner into the works, as Kane made it a triple threat match. And when this one was over, it would be Punk who continued to stand tall. It's just a shame he was still being overshadowed by John Cena then, because in the main event, with a returning Vince McMahon in his corner, he'd take on John Laurinaitis and his hand-picked surrogate, The Big Show. But it wasn't a normal match because, as a result of a stipulation set by the boss himself, if Big Show failed to win, then Johnny Ace would be removed from his on-screen position of authority. So thankfully, Big Match John came out the winner here and put a merciful end to the era of People Power. And with that reign of terror now over, it was on to the next big show of the year, the Great American Bash on July 3rd. Though, in a twist on their usual strategy, the company chose not to air this one as a standalone pay-per-view, but instead, a special episode of SmackDown. Why was this? Well, with the Blue Brand's TV ratings not doing well, it was hoped that such a decision would give them a much-needed boost. But while it did feature some notable moments, such as Ryback continuing his Goldberg-esque rise with a victory over Curt Hawkins, and Zack Ryder winning a 20-man battle royal, in the end, it didn't really have any lasting effects. At least Money in the Bank on July 15th would feel like a much bigger deal though, because there, not only would Sheamus and Alberto Del Rio go to war over the World Heavyweight title, but Dolph Ziggler would earn a shot at this very belt at any time of his choosing by outlasting Christian, Cody Rhodes, Damian Sandow, Santino Marella, Lord Tensai, Sin Cara, and Tyson Kidd in the first Money in the Bank ladder match of the night. Then, once that was done, Ryback's winning streak continued, and John Cena earned a WWE title shot by beating Chris Jericho, The Big Show, Kane, and The Miz in the second Money in the Bank ladder match of the night. But that was all table setting for the real highlight of the night, as going at it one more time, CM Punk and Daniel Bryan had another banger over the WWE title. And to make matters even more interesting, with AJ Lee now growing tired of her on-screen boyfriend's abusive ways, she'd play the special guest referee here. That said, while she didn't choose to screw the American Dragon over here, it wasn't enough to get him the win, as once it was all said and done, the Second City Saints' lengthy reign continued. And with this run going on for so long now, it meant changes would have to be made in order to freshen things up. So that was why, at the special 3-hour edition of Raw 1000 on July 23rd, Punk turned heel when he laid out The Rock with a GTS. Of course, the reason he'd done so was that only moments prior, the Great One had announced he'd be returning at the Royal Rumble to face whoever the champion was then. And that wasn't the only notable moment to come out of this show either, because after AJ Lee left Daniel Bryan at the altar during their wedding, then was announced as the new general manager of Raw going forward, John Cena cashed in his Money in the Bank contract on CM Punk, as the two had a 5-star classic, during which the champ pulled out a very rarely seen in 2012 pile driver. Even after taking this though, Big Match John appeared to have the bout won at one point. That was until the Big Show got involved and caused the challenger to get disqualified, with this marking the first time anyone had ever failed during a Money in the Bank cash-in attempt. So, looking for revenge, Cena would get his hands on the Big Show at SummerSlam on August 19th a few weeks later. And in doing so, he'd also get another shot at the WWE title, because it would be Show versus Cena versus CM Punk in the second to main event. Before that happened, however, the now rebranded NXT would crown its first ever world champion on July 16th when Seth Rollins defeated Jinder Mahal in the finals of a tournament. And once that was over, it was on to the biggest show of the summer, as there, despite successfully defending his belt against the top star in the company, the voice of the voiceless still couldn't get a chance to go on last on pay-per-view. No, that spot would instead be saved for returning Brock Lesnar, as here he sought to settle his beef with Triple H. And thankfully by now, Paul Heyman had returned to WWE too to act as Brock's advocate. So with him in his corner offering advice, Lesnar was able to tap out the game after 18 minutes and 45 seconds, seemingly putting an end to the COO's in-ring career in the process. Elsewhere though, things would work out much better for Sheamus as he successfully defended the World Heavyweight title against Alberto Del Rio. And prior to this, after an attempt to make a match with Charlie Sheen fell through, Daniel Bryan would begin his odd couple alliance with Kane after the two went one-on-one and settled their beef. Of course, had other plans came to pass though, a separate big match would have taken place on this night, as after starting an online feud in the weeks prior, Dean Ambrose was meant to make his debut by facing Mick Foley. Once it became clear that Foley was not going to be able to wrestle though, the whole thing was scrapped. And sure, we would see more of Ambrose before the year was over, but before we get there, September 16th's Night of Champions saw CM Punk go one-on-one with John Cena again. But despite it feeling like it was finally Cena's night here, the match between the two ended in a double pinfall. And that pleased both Punk and his new manager Paul Heyman, as it meant he'd keep the belt around his waist for another month. And he wasn't the only champion who was retaining here, because in the opener, The Miz kept the Intercontinental title around his waist by beating Cody Rhodes, Rey Mysterio, and Sin Cara in a fatal 4-way match. Then, once that was done, Kofi Kingston and R-Truth successfully defended their tag team titles when they got the better of Daniel Bryan and Kane, the newly formed Team Hell No. And as if that weren't enough, following on from this, Antonio Cesaro got the better of Zack Ryder so as to make sure he left the event still the United States champion. Unfortunately for Divas champion Layla though, things wouldn't go as well for her, as she'd end up losing her gold to Eve Torres in a match which lasted just over 7 minutes. And this meant that Torres entered the next pay-per-view of the year, October 28th's Hell in a Cell, as the reigning, defending, top dog in the women's division. That said, given how little importance was placed on this division at this time, her triple threat bout against Layla and Caitlyn drew little interest. No, what fans were far more interested in was the main event, where inside of the cell, following a minor injury picked up by John Cena, Ryback would step in his place as #1 contender to CM Punk's WWE title. Before we get there though, new tag team champions Team Hell No lost their belts to Cody Rhodes and Damien Sandow. Then, once that was over, the Big Show beat Sheamus to become World Heavyweight Champion. Luckily though, IC and US champions Kofi Kingston and Antonio Cesaro would have a much better time of things when they successfully defended their belts against The Miz and Justin Gabriel respectively. And finally, following on from there, the main event saw Streak versus Title as Punk and Ryback finally met one-on-one. Of course, for as over as the challenger was getting here though, even he wasn't good enough to dethrone the Second City Saint, and so it was that after referee Brad Maddox revealed himself to be in league with the champ, he'd execute a fast count in order to let Punk sneak away with the win. But that wouldn't be the end of the feud yet, because heading into November 18th Survivor Series, the big man got his rematch when it was booked to be him versus Punk versus John Cena in a triple threat bout in the main event. That said, even here, with all the odds against him, the champ was still able to come out with the belt around his waist. Of course, in order to do so though, he'd have to get a little help from the newest main roster faction. Yes, this was the debut of The Shield, as, towards the end of the match, Dean Ambrose, Seth Rollins, and Roman Reigns came out of the crowd and triple powerbombed Ryback through the announce table. And while it was unclear what their allegiance, if any, were to Punk, the Second City Saint absolutely took advantage of the moment to score a pinfall over a distracted John Cena. But it wasn't only The Shield's debut which made this night special, because elsewhere, the rest of the card saw Eve Torres successfully defend the Divas title against Caitlyn, Antonio Cesaro get the better of R-Truth during their US title match, and a traditional 5-on-5 Survivor Series elimination bout see Dolph Ziggler, Alberto Del Rio, Wade Barrett, Damien Sandow, and David Otunga defeat Kane, Kofi Kingston, Randy Orton, The Miz, and by now firm fan favorite Daniel Bryan. Still though, for as great as some of these matches were, it was really The Shield everyone wanted to talk about the next night on Raw. So, luckily, they'd make their presence felt when they came down to the ring through the crowd, decked out in riot gear, to announce that from there on in, they were going to be the judge, jury, and executioners of WWE, and that if anyone was deemed to be guilty under their rule, they'd be swiftly taken out by the hounds of justice. Of course, with all three now being main roster exclusives though, it meant Rollins would be forced to drop his NXT World title to Big E Langston on a show that, while it was filmed on December 6th, wouldn't actually air until January of the next year. Then, just 10 days after that, following another Tribute to the Troops show, WWE put on their final pay-per-view of the year, TLC, Tables, Ladders, and Chairs, where for the first time, The Shield hit the ring as a trio. Before this occurred though, Antonio Cesaro and Kofi Kingston would retain their United States and Intercontinental Championships respectively, and the Big Show got the better of Sheamus with the help of a giant steel chair in their bout over the World Heavyweight title. Then, following on from that, the feud which started when Dolph Ziggler accused John Cena of having a fling with AJ Lee hit the ring when Big Match John and the Show-Off went at it in a ladder match over the Money in the Bank contract. Of course, what the challenger didn't expect here was that, come the end of the bout, AJ would turn heel and align herself with Dolph when she pushed Cena off the ladder right into a waiting super kick from his opponent, costing him the match in the process. But while that may have technically been the main event of the night, the real one everyone wanted to see was The Shield versus Team Hell No and Ryback. So thankfully, this didn't disappoint then, because over the course of almost 23 minutes, all 6 men put on a clinic, with the Hounds of Justice proving to be too strong of a unit by the end as they began their lengthy winning streak. And with that big win, it marked the end of the year for WWE, a year where, despite starting off a little shaky, things really got going come the end of things with the firm establishment of CM Punk as a top guy, the continued rise of Daniel Bryan, and the introduction of The Shield. So perhaps it should come as no surprise that as 2013 came around, all 3 of these acts would be the focus of the show in different ways. That said, for as big of a year as it would be for both Punk and the Hounds of Justice, arguably the most memorable thing would be that this was the point where the Yes Movement reached another level altogether. 2013 was a huge year in pop culture. In television, the final episodes of Breaking Bad would air. In film, The Wolf of Wall Street first hit theaters, and meanwhile, over in the WWE, a new era finally felt like it had arrived in full, because over the course of a 12-month period, a generational babyface was about to rise to the top. An anti-authority hero had one foot out the door, and three main eventers of the future were making a major splash. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWE in 2013, a year in review. When we last left off, CM Punk had just reached 400 days as WWE Champion. The Shield were on the warpath, and The Rock was preparing to make yet another return to the ring. And that return, as it happened, would come at the first pay-per-view of the year, January 27th's Royal Rumble. Yes, in front of a sold-out Phoenix crowd, the Great One challenged the Voice of the Voiceless for the top prize in the company, with this marking Punk's greatest challenge to date. But before they got to the ring, the undercard saw some big moments take place, such as Alberto Del Rio winning his World Heavyweight title bout against The Big Show, and Team Hell No successfully defending their tag team titles against Cody Rhodes and Damian Sandow. Then, in the 30-man Royal Rumble match, despite strong efforts from the likes of Chris Jericho and Mr. Money in the Bank Dolph Ziggler, in the end, it was John Cena who came out on top to book his ticket to the main event of WrestleMania. But who would he face? Well, that was decided next, as after 434 days as WWE Champion, CM Punk's run finally came to an end when, even after the Shield attempted to interfere and help him get the win, he was ultimately unable to overcome The Rock. So with this marking the People's Champion's 8th reign on top, he allowed himself a brief celebration, all before then beginning preparations for his bout against John Cena at WrestleMania 29. Before the new champ could focus all of his attention on this, though, he'd have to deal with the fact that Punk, bitter over losing his precious, had stolen the physical belt. And this led to one more bout between the two at February 17th's Elimination Chamber then. That said, it wasn't the only big title news going on around that time, because on January 31st, a couple of weeks before that, NXT crowned their first ever tag team champions when Adrian Neville and Oliver Gray defeated the Wyatt family. Back on the main roster, though, the tag team titles remained firmly around the waists of the industry's top rising star Daniel Bryan and his partner Kane. That said, the two wouldn't defend these belts at Elimination Chamber, as there, they'd both be involved in a match inside of the titular cage, where the winner earned a shot at the World Heavyweight strap. But neither of them would win this one, as come the end, it was Jack Swagger who outlasted Team Hell No, Randy Orton, Chris Jericho, and Mark Henry. And because of that, he'd be set up for a one-on-one bout with the man who defeated The Big Show again earlier that night, Alberto Del Rio. Elsewhere, meanwhile, Dolph Ziggler, who had by now added both AJ Lee and Big E to his crew, got a victory over Kofi Kingston. Caitlyn successfully defended the Divas title against Tamina Snuka, and the Shield's rise continued with a win over John Cena, Ryback, and Sheamus. Then in the main event, after The Rock and CM Punk left everything they had in the ring, it would be the Great One who came out the victor, robbing his opponent of the chance to get that ever-elusive WrestleMania main event. Of course, even if the Second City Saint wasn't getting his, he was about to be awarded a pretty good consolation prize, as in the weeks which followed, he'd be announced as the next challenger to The Undertaker's streak. Then, once that was over, it was time to hit the ring as WrestleMania 29 took place. And there, things kicked off with a bang when the Shield's undefeated streak continued after they scored a win over The Big Show, Randy Orton, and Sheamus. Following on from that, Daniel Bryan's rise continued when Team Hell No successfully defended their tag team titles against Dolph Ziggler and Big E. But while these results were somewhat predictable, what came next certainly wasn't, as in his debut match, Fandango was able to secure a pinfall victory over Chris Jericho. Yes, it was quite a moment, but there was still a lot left to come, yet as after Alberto Del Rio retained the World Heavyweight title during his bout against Jack Swagger, The Undertaker had what many consider to be his final in-ring WrestleMania classic when he beat CM Punk to go 21-0. And with this arguably being the match of the night, it left big shoes for Triple H to fill, as up next, he'd have his rematch with Brock Lesnar, with the Game this time getting the victory. Was it a bad decision to beat Brock for a second time in a year here? Sure. But for as much as it pissed off fans, at least it wasn't as bad as the main event, as there, in a bout which had none of the specialness of the year prior, The Rock blew out multiple muscles and tendons en route to losing to John Cena. So, with the show ending with old faces such as Cena and Triple H back on top once more, the next night on Raw, fans openly rebelled by hijacking the show. And this included lots of boring chants for things such as a Randy Orton Sheamus snoozer, lots of yes chants for an all-time great Money in the Bank cash-in from Dolph Ziggler on Alberto Del Rio, and even a bizarre situation where singing Fandango's theme briefly turned it into an internet meme. Perhaps then people hoped at the time WWE would listen to what their audience was telling them and make changes wherever required. Of course, this would require Vince McMahon being willing to do so though, and with that feeling highly unlikely, most weren't hopeful of such a result. But that's not to suggest there weren't things the company were doing right here, because at the next big pay-per-view of the year, Extreme Rules on May 19th, the Shield's rise reached another level altogether when all three men walked out of the show with gold around their waists. And while in Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins' case, this would come as a result of them dethroning Team Hell No for the tag team titles, when it came to Dean Ambrose, he'd earn a singles strap when he defeated Kofi Kingston for the United States belt. Outside of that, however, the rest of the show was fairly dull, as it was filled with matches such as Sheamus vs. Mark Henry, Randy Orton vs. The Big Show, and John Cena vs. Ryback. Hell, even a steel cage main event between Brock Lesnar and Triple H couldn't salvage things, because despite the Beast getting the win here, by now, his aura was waning badly. Of course, things wouldn't get much better the next month either, as just a few weeks after Bo Dallas beat Big E to become the new NXT champion down in the developmental brand, the main roster held Payback on June 16th. And here it was, another pretty weak show overall, with the only real notable moments being AJ Lee beating Caitlyn to win the Divas title, and Dolph Ziggler's run with the World Heavyweight title coming to an untimely end after Alberto Del Rio got the better of him. Well, we suppose there was something else which happened here, and that was the return of CM Punk as a babyface, because following a brief sabbatical post-WrestleMania, the Second City Saint returned in his hometown to a rapturous ovation. But even if he was back, it was clear his heart wasn't in it anymore, as could be evidenced with his shaggy hair and his sleepwalking through his bout with Chris Jericho. No, after growing increasingly disillusioned with the fact he had to lose the WWE title to The Rock and not main event WrestleMania, Punk was already thinking about quitting altogether. But one person who wasn't thinking about quitting was Mark Henry, as the next night on Raw, after fooling the world with a fake retirement ceremony which featured a now iconic salmon jacket, he'd attack John Cena and challenge him for the WWE title at July 14th's Money in the Bank pay-per-view. And while this proved to be a pretty good match when it came, it was far from the highlight of the night. No, in a show which somewhat reinvigorated WWE right when they needed it the most, the Shield would continue to reign tall when Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins defeated the Usos in a tag team title match. Then once that was over, the first of two Money in the Bank ladder matches was won by Damien Sandow when he beat Cody Rhodes, Fandango, Antonio Cesaro, Jack Swagger, Wade Barrett, and Dean Ambrose to earn a shot at the World Heavyweight title at a time of his choosing. Of course, this title would be held by Alberto Del Rio once the show was over, as he'd once again fend off the challenge of Dolph Ziggler here, and he wasn't the only champion successfully defending at Money in the Bank either, because elsewhere, AJ Lee beat Caitlyn in the rematch for the Divas title, Curtis Axel retained his newly won Intercontinental strap against The Miz, and John Cena got the better of Mark Henry in their battle over the WWE Championship. But even that ladder showdown wasn't the main event here. No, this honor would go to the Money in the Bank ladder match for a WWE title shot, where Randy Orton beat CM Punk, Daniel Bryan, Christian, Sheamus, and a returning Rob Van Dam for that honor. That said, despite now having a title shot at the time of his choosing, the Viper wouldn't be the one challenging John Cena at SummerSlam on August 18th. No, after months of fan demand, the company decided to cave in at this point and give the shot of a lifetime to none other than Daniel Bryan. Yes, the Yes movement was finally being heard, and the American Dragon was getting his due. Of course, even if he was getting this token main event spot though, it was still highly unlikely he'd actually win. No, the expectation was still very much that John Cena would be walking out the champion, but before fans found out if that was indeed the case, they'd see a new champion be crowned elsewhere when, down in NXT, Paige was defeating Emma to become the inaugural women's champion on that brand. Over on the main roster though, the Divas title didn't have quite the same level of prestige, as at SummerSlam, AJ Lee didn't even get to defend the belt on the show. No, instead she'd have to settle for a mixed tag match where she and Big E took on her now by ex on-screen boyfriend Dolph Ziggler and her former best friend Caitlyn. At least the rest of the card was better for the most part though, because after weeks of teasing, the mysterious Wyatt family finally made their main roster debut when their leader Bray Wyatt defeated Kane in a Ring of Fire bout. And that wasn't all which was worth watching here either, as later in the show, CM Punk, someone who had by now severed his allegiances to Paul Heyman, was forced to take on the former ECW owner's other client in Brock Lesnar. But despite arguably having the match of the year here, the Second City Saint ultimately came out the loser against a part-time performer for the third time in a year, with this only serving to increase his frustration with the company. Not that fans knew just how upset he was at the time, however, because all they were focused on was the main event where, in the fairy tale ending no one dared dream of, Daniel Bryan beat John Cena clean to become the WWE Champion. That said, this proved to be a short reign, as just seconds later, a pedigree from special guest referee Triple H allowed Randy Orton to cash in his Money in the Bank contract and steal the title away. And that act started one of the most fascinating storylines in recent memory, because while on screen, the Authority explained they'd screwed the American Dragon out of the gold as he just wasn't seen by management as a top guy. This was actually the real situation behind the scenes too, when it came to the way Vince McMahon looked at Bryan. But not wanting to see another potential star be buried before he even got the chance, fans only got louder in the rebellion as the weeks went on. So in an attempt to appease them then, WWE booked the rematch between Bryan and Orton at September 15th's Night of Champions. Of course, while it did at first feel like the S Movement got the result they wanted here when the fan favorite beat the Viper to regain the WWE title, things proved to be not so clear-cut the following night on Raw, as there, in a classic dusty finish, the decision was reversed and the belt was held up as vacant by the Authority after they determined the referee had executed a fast count. And Daniel Bryan wasn't the only babyface having problems at this point either. No, following a loss to Paul Heyman and Curtis Axel at Night of Champions, CM Punk continued to spiral too. Still, at least his by then real-life girlfriend was having a better time as, now portraying herself as an anti-hero going after the Total Divas era of the women's division, AJ Lee positioned herself as an early precursor to what would later turn into a full-blown revolution. And this storyline would lead directly into October 6th's Battleground pay-per-view, as there, Lee defended her Divas title against someone who was one of the faces of the Divas era, Brie Bella. But while the champ was able to retain in this one, other title holders wouldn't be so lucky, because even if their tag team belts weren't on the line, the Shield picked up a big loss to Cody Rhodes and Goldust. Of course, the reason this one was so special though was because, in a side story to Daniel Bryan's battles with the Authority, the Rhodes family had drawn the ire of Triple H and Stephanie too, and as a result, were forced to defeat the Hounds of Justice in order to keep their jobs. Yes, by now Ambrose, Reigns, and Rollins had become the hired guns of the Authority, but they weren't the only trio catching the attention of fans anymore. No, elsewhere on the card, despite being portrayed as heels, the Wyatt family were continuing to capture audiences' hearts everywhere, and this meant they were only too happy to cheer along as Bray Wyatt defeated Kofi Kingston at this show. And the good times didn't stop there for the live crowd either, because following this, CM Punk finally got a win again when he beat another Paul Heyman guy in the form of Ryback. So, with this marking a highlight of the show, it's just a shame what came next was so limp, as in one of the worst main events in WWE history, Daniel Bryan and Randy Orton went to a no contest when the Big Show ran in towards the end and knocked both men out with a WMD punch. Needless to say then, fans let the company know how they felt about this once the match was over, and with their patience growing thin now, it was hoped that the final showdown between Bryan and Orton at Hell in a Cell a few weeks later would see the American Dragon put things to bed and get a proper run with the WWE title. Before this took place, however, further cold water was thrown on the whole thing when, in an attempt to kill Bryan's heat, Vince McMahon turned the Big Show babyface and had him start doing the yes chants himself. And the reason for this was because the notoriously bullheaded boss had come to believe fans weren't into the Washington native himself. No, as far as he saw it, it was just the chant which was over. Meanwhile, the Rhodes brothers would defeat Seth Rollins and Roman Reigns on the October 14th episode of Raw to win the tag team titles. Really though, the show's main focus was Daniel Bryan now, and so, as Hell in a Cell came on October 27th, fans were praying to see him beat Randy Orton for the WWE title. Instead of getting this, however, they'd be given a main event inside of the titular cage, where special guest referee Shawn Michaels screwed the American Dragon out of the victory. And to make matters worse, this wasn't even being done with the intention of setting up a Bryan vs. Michaels dream match. No, feeling like his time in the main event scene was over, the loss here would see Bryan move back down to the upper mid-card. But that wasn't the only reason people came out of this show frustrated, because after a brief highlight when CM Punk defeated Ryback and Paul Heyman in a handicap bout, John Cena won the World Heavyweight title from Alberto Del Rio, with this marking his 14th world title overall. Yes, it was back to the old guard for Vince McMahon, and this meant that when Damien Sandow cashed in his Money in the Bank contract on Cena the next night on Raw, he'd lose in swift fashion. Meanwhile, when it came to the fans' choices, CM Punk and Daniel Bryan, they'd be cut out of the title picture entirely, as at November 24th Survivor Series, they'd pair up to take on Luke Harper and Eric Rowan of the Wyatt family. And then this left the door open for all too familiar figures like Alberto Del Rio and The Big Show to challenge for the World Heavyweight and WWE titles respectively. That said, at least some new blood was getting a chance to shine, as in a traditional 5-on-5 Survivor Series elimination match, The Shield teamed with the Real Americans to beat the Rhodes Brothers, the Usos, and Rey Mysterio. Then, after that, Big E's slow rise would get going when he won an Intercontinental title bout against Curtis Axel. So by the time the show was over then, many fans were still left clamoring for Daniel Bryan to get his big push, as they hadn't forgotten about him. Luckily then, the audience got an opportunity to vent their frustrations on the December 9th episode of Raw, because during a championship ascension ceremony designed to hype the upcoming title unification match between the Viper and Big Match John, Triple H was unable to finish his promo without being drowned out by a sea of yes chant. That's right, the fan discontentment over treatment of the American Dragon was now reaching a point where it was becoming disruptive to the show. And as a result of this, even old legends such as Steve Austin and Mick Foley publicly called for WWE to push Daniel Bryan in the main event. But Vince McMahon still had no intention of doing so, and that was why, after another Tribute to the Troops show on December 11th, he'd head into the last pay-per-view of the year, TLC, Tables, Ladders, and Chairs on December 15th, with a card that saw the leader of the Yes Movement still in an upper mid-card feud with the Wyatt family. Hell, on that night in fact he'd face all three members of the Wyatts in a handicap match, and when he lost this one, he'd even join up with the group. Elsewhere meanwhile, the Shield hit a roadblock when, in a 3-on-1 handicap match against CM Punk, they'd actually lose, with this marking a rare time they were allowed to look weak. Not that the victory did much for Punk though, because by this point he was so frustrated, he pretty much had one foot out the door. Still, at least AJ Lee was having a better time because later in the show, she was able to successfully defend her Divas title against Natalya. And Big E was able to do the same with his IC belt too, as it happened when he faced off against Damian Sandow. Then, as if that weren't enough, the Rhodes Brothers continued their run as tag team champions when they beat the Real Americans, Ryback, and The Big Show and Rey Mysterio in a fatal 4-way tag team elimination match. But when it came to the main event, only one man could come out as top dog. And in the end, that would prove to be Randy Orton, as for the first time since 2002, WWE had an undisputed world champion once more. And with this victory, it meant the Viper would end the year as champ. That said, the decision to put him in this spot instead of Daniel Bryan was still proving to be so unpopular that the company were now beginning to worry fans would continue to vocally rebel all the way up until WrestleMania and beyond. Of course, the solution to this problem was staring WWE in the face to go with the superstar the audiences wanted. But would Vince McMahon go with the fans? Well, we'd have to wait till the following year to find this out, but it was all worth it as it led to one of the greatest moments in wrestling history. 2014 was, in many ways, a year of transition, as in the world of pop culture, not only was Jimmy Fallon taking over Jay Leno as the host of The Tonight Show, but we also saw the Breaking Bad universe continue with Better Call Saul. And over in the world of wrestling, things were in just as much of a state of flux because with the Yes Movement reaching new heights, we'd finally see the culmination of one of the all-time great storylines, all while a brand new crop of superstars were rising to the top. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWE in 2014, a year in review. When we last left off, Randy Orton had just beaten John Cena to become the undisputed WWE World Heavyweight Champion, CM Punk was undergoing severe burnout with the company, and Daniel Bryan was the most over person the wrestling industry had seen in a long time. That said, even if he was beloved by most watching, Vince McMahon just didn't see him as anything more than a B-plus player. So in order to stop some of his heat then, the boss had gone as far as to turn Bryan heel by having him align with the villainous Wyatt family. But plans would change yet again when, after reportedly seeing a crowd full of people doing the yes chant at a basketball game, Vince decided he needed the American Dragon as a babyface once more. And so that was why, on the January 13th episode of Raw, the fan favorite turned face again when he got Bray Wyatt trapped inside of a cage, then proceeded to give him a beatdown, all to one of the loudest ovations in history. Of course, with things now as they should be, many began to wonder if this proved plans had indeed changed and Bryan was going to win the Royal Rumble after all. The only problem with this theory, though, was that in the weeks leading up to the Rumble, it was announced that Batista would be returning and that he had intentions of winning himself. And that led us into January 26th, where, in front of a packed Pittsburgh crowd, the night began with Daniel Bryan not only losing to the Eater of Worlds, but also getting kayfabe injured in the process too. That said, most fans felt they could see through this as they believed the injury was being done so their hero could make a dramatic return in the Rumble itself. Before we get there though, the rest of the undercard saw Brock Lesnar demolish the Big Show in preparation for his WrestleMania showdown with The Undertaker, and Randy Orton retained the WWE World Heavyweight title once more against John Cena. Then in the main event, anticipation was sky high as things started out with CM Punk entering at number 1. But while he was certainly still a fan favorite here, the real person most wanted to see win was the American Dragon. So much did they want this, in fact, that once Batista entered at number 28, he was roundly booed. This despite the fact he was a babyface. And that booing only got worse when Rey Mysterio came out at number 30 and it had become apparent to all that Daniel Bryan was not going to be involved. Yes, the fans now turned on the match itself, and so when Batista won at the end after last eliminating Rusev, the live crowd let him know just how unhappy they were about the result. And with CM Punk finally having reached his breaking point during the Rumble match, he'd show up backstage at Raw the next night and immediately go to meet with Vince McMahon and Triple H. And it was during the course of this meeting that he'd tell them he was going home and wouldn't be returning again. Of course, at the time, the boss thought it was just Punk being angry and that once he cooled off, he'd be back, but as it turned out, this was the end of the voice of the voiceless in WWE for a long time. So needless to say, this threw a lot of WrestleMania plans up in the air as Punk was supposed to have a big-time match there against The Game. But even if this had gone ahead as planned, it still wouldn't have fixed the problem of what to do about Daniel Bryan. Yes, at this time, plans were still for Batista versus Randy Orton at the Showcase of the Immortals instead. Of course, fans were so turned off by this prospect, though, that they booed Big Dave every time he came out to the ring, with this leading to his opponent at February 23rd's Elimination Chamber, Alberto Del Rio, actually getting cheered. But for as disappointed as people were with the main event scene, there was at least one big dream match they'd get to see that night as, in a 6-man tag, The Shield clashed with the Wyatt family in one of the most heated encounters we had seen in years. Yes, it was the rare example of a true dream match taking place in the modern age. And once it was done and people's mood had been lifted, the live crowd even allowed themselves to believe we might have Daniel Bryan win the WWE World Heavyweight title in the main event. But how was he going to do this? Well, by being part of the Elimination Chamber match, which also included John Cena, Cesaro, Christian, Sheamus, and champion Randy Orton. Sadly though, the Dragon did not come out of this the winner, as instead, Corporate Kane interfered and helped the Viper to retain come the end. And unfortunately for Batista, this was something which continued to haunt him over the weeks which followed, because with fans still not taking to him, the Animal was forced to turn heel. Meanwhile, down in NXT, the future was looking bright as on February 27th, they'd host their first ever network special, NXT Arrival, with a card that saw Paige retain the brand's women's title against Emma, Adrian Neville win the NXT World title from Bo Dallas, and Sami Zayn continue his losing streak with a loss to Cesaro. And this was the first show to ever air live on the newly launched WWE Network. Then on the March 10th episode of Raw, we saw a segment where fans invaded the ring and demanded Daniel Bryan be inserted into the WrestleMania main event. Of course, with nothing else to do then, Triple H came out and announced that the American Dragon would get to make it a triple threat match between him, Randy Orton, and Batista, but only if he could beat The Game first. And that led us directly into the biggest show of the year on April 6th, where the night after Scott Hall, Lita, Paul Bearer, Jake the Snake Roberts, and the Ultimate Warrior were inducted into the Hall of Fame, WrestleMania took place in New Orleans, where a rabid crowd hoped to see a miracle on Bourbon Street. Thankfully then, the night started off on the right foot as in the opener, after a historic in-ring meeting took place between Steve Austin, The Rock, and Hulk Hogan, Daniel Bryan defeated Triple H to book his spot in the main event. And following that, the exciting times continued when The Shield beat Attitude Era stars The New Age Outlaws and Kane, Cesaro won the first ever Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, and in a shock to many fans, Bray Wyatt lost to John Cena. But this wasn't the biggest shocker of the night as it turned out, because following on from there, the unthinkable occurred when Brock Lesnar beat The Undertaker to end his near 2.5-decade-long undefeated WrestleMania streak. So needless to say, this left the crowd in stunned silence as they had come to terms with the fact that the dead man was mortal after all. And it left a tough task for the main event too, because despite Daniel Bryan being the man of the hour, it took about 15 minutes for him, Randy Orton, and Batista to get fans invested again during their triple threat match after they'd just seen the streak end. Luckily though, by the time the climax was approaching, the trio had the crowd in the palm of their hands once more. And when after 28 minutes and 20 seconds, the Animal tapped out to the babyface hero, the whole stadium erupted with cheers the likes of which hadn't been seen since Eddie Guerrero won the title a decade prior. Yes, it was the feel-good moment fans had dreamed for. And that wasn't the end of the big moments for the weekend either, because the next night on Raw, after the new WWE World Heavyweight Champion had come out to a hero's response earlier in the night, Paige made her main roster debut by defeating AJ Lee to become the new Divas Champion, and it was also on this Raw that the Ultimate Warrior would make his final on-screen appearance, as he would tragically pass away the following day. And that would lead us into the next pay-per-view of the year, May 4th's Extreme Rules, as there, after relinquishing her NXT Women's title, the Norwich native made her first big defense against Tamina Snuka. But that wasn't the big story of this show, because after Triple H decided to reform Evolution with Batista and Randy Orton in order to take out the now babyface Shield, all 6 men went to war in a show-stealing tag match. Of course, come the end of that one, it was the Hounds of Justice standing tall, and someone else who was standing tall was Bray Wyatt because in his steel cage rematch with John Cena, he'd get the win. Then, in the main event, Daniel Bryan successfully defended the WWE World Heavyweight title against Kane. That said, bigger problems were on the horizon for the American Dragon, because as a result of a nagging shoulder injury, he'd have to sit the next month out as he tried his best to heal up. And this meant that at June 1st's Payback, just 3 days after NXT TakeOver saw Charlotte Flair defeat Natalya to become the brand's new women's champion, and Adrian Neville successfully defend his own belt against Tyson Kidd, the main event of the night would be the final showdown between The Shield and Evolution. Yes, this time it was a no-holds-barred elimination match, something Triple H thought would give his team the advantage. Unfortunately for the game though, by the end of this one it was a clean sweep for the babyfaces as they all stood tall. Elsewhere on the card meanwhile, Bray Wyatt lost to John Cena for a second time, but for as much as this upset many fans, they'd have bigger things to focus on the next night on Raw, when in a shock move, Seth Rollins turned on his Shield brothers and joined forces with the Authority. So with the Architect instantly becoming the most hated man in the company as a result of this, it was left to Dean Ambrose to seek revenge against him as Roman Reigns instead segued into a program with Randy Orton. But the latter two wouldn't have their singles bout quite yet because after Daniel Bryan's continued injury meant he was forced to vacate the WWE World Heavyweight title on the June 9th episode of Raw, it led to one of the upcoming Money in the Bank ladder matches at June 29th's titular pay-per-view now being for the belts themselves. Before that took place though, the undercard saw numerous successful title defenses when the Usos beat the Wyatt family and Paige defeated Naomi. Then, in the first Money in the Bank ladder match of the night, the Authority's new Golden Boy Seth Rollins outlasted Dolph Ziggler, Jack Swagger, Kofi Kingston, Rob Van Dam, and Dean Ambrose to win a title shot at a time of his choosing. That said, he wouldn't be the man on top come the end of the night though, because that honor went to John Cena instead when he beat Alberto Del Rio, Bray Wyatt, Kane, Randy Orton, Sheamus, Cesaro, and Roman Reigns to become the 15-time world champ. And when Rollins tried to cash in the next night on Raw in order to win this title, he'd be foiled by the Lunatic Fringe, as he from there vowed to never let his former Shield brother use the briefcase. So, needing to execute Plan C if they wanted to get the belt off Big Match John then, Triple H brought in a mercenary in the form of Brock Lesnar, someone who hadn't been seen since breaking The Undertaker's streak at WrestleMania. Of course, following such a feat, the Beast was fully established as the final boss of wrestling going forward. But while this left fans to wonder just how the SummerSlam main event would go once the two faced off in August, they'd still have to wait a while for that yet, because first, on July 20th, Battleground took place in Tampa, Florida. And on this show, it would all be about the belts again, as well a recently returned AJ Lee was defending the Divas title she regained from Paige a few weeks prior. Elsewhere, The Miz was winning a battle royal to crown a new Intercontinental Champion, and John Cena was successfully walking out of a fatal four-way match against Randy Orton, Kane, and Roman Reigns, with the belt still around his waist. So that would lead us right into SummerSlam on August 17th, where, in the opening two bouts of the night, the Intercontinental and Divas titles both changed hands when Dolph Ziggler and Paige beat The Miz and AJ Lee, respectively. And once this was over, the excitement continued as after Rusev continued his rise up the card with a win over Jack Swagger, and Bray Wyatt regained some credibility by beating Chris Jericho, Seth Rollins and Dean Ambrose finally got to go one-on-one, with this round ultimately going to the Architect. Luckily for Dean's buddy Roman Reigns though, he'd have a much better time of things, because in his first ever pay-per-view singles match, he'd get a victory over Randy Orton. But that was all table setting for the main event, because there, one of the most one-sided main event squash matches in wrestling history took place when Brock Lesnar absolutely buried John Cena. Seriously, it's impossible to overstate just how brutal and shocking this was to see when it happened, because over the course of 16 minutes, Brock delivered 16 suplexes to the champ and left him barely able to get a lick of offense in. So needless to say, once it was over, there was a new WWE World Heavyweight Champion, with this being news which delighted the Authority. Not that Cena was done yet though. No, quite the opposite in fact, because after executing his rematch clause, he'd book himself a rematch at September 21st's Night of Champions pay-per-view. Before we'd get there though, NXT had another big show when TakeOver Fatal 4-Way saw Charlotte defeat Bayley in a women's title match, and Adrian Neville defend the brand's world title against Tyson Kidd, Tyler Breeze, and Sami Zayn. That said, for as dominating as Neville was over on the black and gold brand, he was nothing compared to what Brock Lesnar was doing on the main roster, because when the time came for his match against Cena, he not only retained via disqualification, but afterwards, he'd disappear for the rest of the year, effectively taking the belt hostage with him in the process. Yes, as the part-time champion, the Beast did whatever. So, in his absence, it was left to the other belts to pick up the slack, as with AJ Lee and The Miz once again winning the Divas and Intercontinental titles respectively at Night of Champions, they became the de facto top champs of the company. Of course, had Roman Reigns still been around at this point, it may very well have been him who was going after the IC strap next, but unfortunately, a hernia picked up while training around then had put the big dog out of action and forced him to take some time away. And while this was a big blow for WWE considering he was primed to serve as the company's next top star, the hope was that with enough rest and recovery, he'd be back in time for the Royal Rumble in January. That said, in his absence, someone would have to take the ball and run with it in the meantime. So it's lucky then that there were two people sitting patiently in the wings, just waiting for their chance to go all the way to the main event. Yes, at Hell in a Cell on October 26th, in lieu of Brock or Roman being there, WWE decided that Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins would blow off their feud by going last inside of the cage. But while this was indeed a big opportunity for the new generation, and they certainly proved their worth with a great match, in the end, the whole thing would be hampered by an ending which saw the Lunatic Fringe lose after being distracted by a strange Bray Wyatt hologram. That's right, by now Bray Wyatt was seemingly losing a little bit of his luster. And also on this show, we saw the showdown between Brie and Nikki Bella, and a big-time match pitting John Cena against Randy Orton. And following this, WWE decided to shake things up a little when at November 23rd Survivor Series, they'd book a massive 5-on-5 traditional elimination match in which, if John Cena's team of him, Dolph Ziggler, The Big Show, Ryback, and Eric Rowan could beat the Authority's team of Seth Rollins, Kane, Rusev, Mark Henry, and Luke Harper, then the heel unit would be forced to disappear from TV forever. But having no desire to disband, the Authority ended up throwing many roadblocks in the babyface's path during the 43-minute runtime of this one. Hell, at one point, after the Big Show completed his traditional turn of the month, it was left to Dolph Ziggler to fight Rollins, Kane, and Harper alone. Of course, while things may have looked dire here, there was someone waiting in the wings to save the day, and that was none other than Sting! Yes, it was at the close of this one when Steve Borden finally made his long-awaited WWE debut by coming out to fend off Triple H. And once he was done with that, he'd even helped the show off to get the pin over the Architect for the win. So with Team Cena coming out the victors, it meant the next night on Raw, the Authority would be forced to say their goodbyes. But even if they were gone, it wasn't the end of the year for WWE yet, because after NXT TakeOver Our Evolution on December 11th saw not only the crowning of Sami Zayn as the Black and Gold brand's new champion, but also the debut and immediate heel turn of Kevin Owens, it was onwards to Cleveland, Ohio for TLC, Tables, Ladders, and Chairs just 3 days later. And here, with the Authority no longer being a factor, it meant the babyfaces got to have some shine again when Dolph Ziggler won the Intercontinental title from Luke Harper in an excellent ladder match, The Usos beat The Miz and his personal stunt double Damien Mizdow for the tag team titles, and John Cena defeated Seth Rollins in order to become #1 contender to Brock Lesnar's WWE World Heavyweight title. But that wasn't all which was happening here, because elsewhere, the recently formed New Day got their first spot on pay-per-view when two of their members, Big E and Kofi Kingston, got the better of the Rhodes brothers, and Rusev reigned tall as the United States champion following a victory over Jack Swagger. As well as this, we saw a stairs match between The Big Show and Eric Rowan. Nikki Bella defended her Divas title against AJ Lee, and Dean Ambrose versus Bray Wyatt. And only a couple of weeks later, on the December 29th episode of Raw, the year closed when the Authority got their way back into power and set about putting their own guy, Seth Rollins, back on top. Yes, it was a wild year of ups and downs, with it marking the climax of the Yes Movement, the breakup of The Shield, the end of the streak, and the exit of CM Punk. But it would be until 2015 that we truly saw the rise of the Big Dog, a man who would become the face of the company for the next decade. 2015 was a huge year in pop culture. In film, we saw the release of The Big Short. In live theaters, the debut of the Broadway sensation Hamilton was taking place, and in TV, the final episode of Mad Men first aired. And meanwhile, over in the WWE, things were about to change forever with the rise of both NXT and a women's revolution. Of course, that wasn't all that was taking place this year. No, there was a lot more exciting stories that took place. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWE in 2015, a year in review. When we last left off, Brock Lesnar was the WWE World Heavyweight Champion, Seth Rollins was Mr. Money in the Bank, and the Authority were back in power. That said, any good times the heel group were feeling would be thrown into disarray when, in the weeks leading up to the show, Daniel Bryan returned to Raw to announce he was finally cleared to wrestle once more. Of course, given he'd announced this just in time for the Royal Rumble, many fans assumed it meant he'd be winning, then go on to challenge Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania. However, this idea was muddied by the fact that Roman Reigns was the new chosen one for Vince McMahon, and that there was equally as good of a chance he'd be winning the match. So heading into the Rumble on January 25th, this became the big question. But before we'd find out the answer to who WWE decided to go with, the undercard saw the Usos retain their tag team titles against The Miz and Damien Mizdow, and in one of the greatest triple threat matches ever, Brock Lesnar successfully defended the WWE World Heavyweight title against both John Cena and Seth Rollins. But for as excellent as this one was, it was the last thing people were thinking about come the end of the night, as, in the main event, after entering at number 10, Daniel Bryan would be eliminated mere minutes later. So, seeing the writing on the wall, many fans in attendance turned on the match for the second year running, and when Reigns won, the boos only got louder. Hell, even a surprise appearance from the Big Dog's cousin The Rock wasn't enough to get people on his side. No, understanding that their new hero was being chosen for them, one of the biggest examples of audiences turning on a performer would begin. And meanwhile, over on NXT, the show was continuing to thrive because on February 11th at Full Sail University, they held TakeOver Rival, a show which saw Finn Balor in full demon paint defeat Adrian Neville. The Four Horsewomen collide when Sasha Banks bested Charlotte Flair, Bayley, and Becky Lynch for the brand's women's title. And in the main event, Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens' years-long rivalry cross over to WWE when KO beat his best friend by technical knockout to win the NXT World title. Back on Raw and SmackDown, though, fans were still not taking to Roman Reigns in the lead-up to his WrestleMania showdown with Brock Lesnar. So it was then that he'd take on Daniel Bryan at February 22nd's Fastlane, with the hope here being that if he could take out the American Dragon cleanly, then hopefully fans would start to cheer for him. Of course, it wasn't enough though, and after the Big Dog scored the pinfall victory over Bryan, fans still booed him. That said, they did get plenty of things to cheer at this show, as it was the one which saw Rusev beat John Cena by technical submission, Goldust and Stardust get their long-awaited singles bout, and Sting show up again to challenge Triple H to a match at WrestleMania. But while this was a match no one thought they would ever see, it wasn't as much of a hell-freezing-over moment as what took place on March 28th when Randy Savage was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. Yes, after years of fan demand, the Macho Man finally got his due, and he wasn't alone in being inducted that year either, as the rest of the class was made up of names such as Kevin Nash, Rikishi, Alundra Blaze, and Larry Zbyszko. That said, the good atmosphere created by this would be fleeting, as the next night at WrestleMania 31, many fans were ready and waiting to boo Roman Reigns out of the building during the main event. Before we get there though, the undercard saw Damian Mizdow finally break free of the shackles of his boss The Miz during the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, Daniel Bryan win the Intercontinental title in a ladder match which also included Dean Ambrose, Dolph Ziggler, Bad News Barrett, Stardust, Luke Harper, and R-Truth, and now babyface Randy Orton beat Seth Rollins by means of the greatest RKO of all time. Then, once that was done, Sting and Triple H finally went one-on-one. And while the match which followed was a great nostalgia trip which saw both the NWO and DX get involved, many people didn't like the ending, as Sting would lose his big WWE debut match. And after this, John Cena would defeat Rusev to start his iconic second reign with the United States title. And following from this, once AJ Lee gave her pay-per-view farewell to WWE by teaming with Paige to defeat the Bella Twins, and Ronda Rousey made a cameo appearance to help The Rock beat up The Authority, The Undertaker returned to face Bray Wyatt. And sure, with the streak now being over, a lot of the magic wasn't quite the same, but even taking this into consideration, it was great to see the Dead Man again as he scored another victory at the Showcase of the Immortals. What wasn't nice to see for many fans watching though was the main event where Roman Reigns was mercilessly booed as soon as he came through the curtain. That said, for as much as he was booed, he and Brock would shatter expectations by having an absolute 5-star classic here, one which was made all the better by the ending that saw Seth Rollins cash in his Money in the Bank contract to commit the heist of the century and win the WWE World Heavyweight title. Yes, realizing he couldn't end the show with Reigns winning, Vince McMahon had chosen to make a last-minute pivot. But while this would delight the live crowd, it upset many of the Anoa'i family who were backstage and who had come with the specific intention of seeing their boy get the victory. So, with tensions high, the next night on Raw was a predictably eventful one as it saw AJ Lee officially retire, Brock Lesnar get kayfabe suspended, and Daniel Bryan make one of his only Intercontinental title defenses. And the reason for the latter was because after suffering a concussion, the American Dragon was pulled from all upcoming events until a doctor could clear him again. Of course, this meant his planned IC title defense at April 26th's Extreme Rules wouldn't take place then. No, instead that card saw other highlights such as the New Day winning the tag team titles from Cesaro and Tyson Kidd, John Cena and Rusev going at it again in a Russian chain match, and Seth Rollins making his first successful world title defense against Randy Orton inside of a steel cage. As for Roman Reigns, well, he'd win his last man standing bout against the Big Show, but it wouldn't be enough to get him cheered. And he wouldn't get cheered at May 17th's Payback either, where he went against Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose, and Randy Orton in a fatal four-way match for the WWE World Heavyweight title. So thankfully for fans then, he didn't win this one. No, that honor went to the Architect instead as he continued his reign on top. Elsewhere on the card, meanwhile, the rest of the show would be made up of such highlights as the now fully called up Neville getting a win over Wade Barrett and John Cena beating Rusev again in an I Quit match to end their feud. But this wasn't the end of Big Match John's US title run though, because both before and after his final showdown with the Bulgarian Brute, he'd be hosting an open challenge on Raw every week. And this allowed him to put on some of his best performances ever, as in a late career revival, he'd shine against the likes of Cesaro, Dean Ambrose, and Sami Zayn. That said, his biggest challenge to date wouldn't come until the May 18th episode of Raw, as it was then NXT World Champion Kevin Owens invaded the main roster and began the build to a match between the two. Before that happened though, KO would have to defend his title against Sami Zayn at TakeOver Unstoppable on May 20th, and while he would retain here, it was only after things went to a no contest once it became clear a shoulder injury meant Sami could no longer compete. But that wasn't the only notable moment of the Black and Gold brand's time in the spotlight here, as elsewhere, Sasha Banks successfully defended her women's title against Becky Lynch, and Finn Balor scored a victory over Tyler Breeze. Of course, for as critically acclaimed as this show was, however, it would be pushed to the back of fans' minds just 11 days later then, as in Corpus Christi, Texas, Elimination Chamber took place. And while there was plenty of note happening here, such as Dean Ambrose beating Seth Rollins by disqualification and Ryback winning the now vacant Intercontinental title after Daniel Bryan's ongoing injury status forced him to relinquish it, the real story was that in one of the greatest called shots ever, Kevin Owens pinned John Cena clean in the middle of the ring in a non-title bout. So heading into Money in the Bank on June 14th then, KO felt confident he could do the same again. Unfortunately for him though, when the time for the rematch came that night, he'd end up losing after finding himself on the receiving end of 3 attitude adjustments. Elsewhere on the show, meanwhile, Seth Rollins managed to beat Dean Ambrose when the two faced off in a ladder match for the WWE World Heavyweight title. Sheamus won a Money in the Bank ladder match, which also included Dolph Ziggler, Kane, Kofi Kingston, Neville, Randy Orton, and Roman Reigns, and Nikki Bella successfully defended her Divas title against Paige. That said, so little attention had been given to the ladder feud and the women's division in general that many fans were now starting to ask for the women to get more time. So, hoping to address these fans, on the July 13th episode of Raw, just 9 days after WWE held a show in Tokyo, Japan entitled The Beast in the East, which saw Finn Balor beat Kevin Owens for the NXT World title, Stephanie McMahon came out to the ring and announced the call-up of Charlotte Flair, Sasha Banks, and Becky Lynch. Yes, in what was being called the Divas Revolution, the plan was now to give more focus to the women on the show, as had been done on NXT for some time. And this would carry into July 19th's Battleground, as there, Charlotte defeated Sasha Banks and Brie Bella in a triple threat match. But this wasn't all that was happening here, because elsewhere, Bray Wyatt and Roman Reigns went one-on-one, John Cena got another victory over Kevin Owens in their rubber match for the US title, and in the main event, Seth Rollins managed to leave his bout against a returning Brock Lesnar, still the champion, after The Undertaker made a shock return and cost Brock the belt. Needless to say then, Lesnar wanted revenge, and this would lead to the rematch of the century at SummerSlam just 1 month later. Before we get there though, NXT had another big show when, on August 22nd, they took to the road for the first time and held TakeOver Brooklyn inside of a sold-out Barclays Center. And there, while the likes of Finn Balor defeating Kevin Owens in a ladder match for the NXT World title, and Jushin Thunder Liger making his lone WWE appearance to take on Tyler Breeze were certainly highlights, the real show-stealing moment came when Sasha Banks and Bayley had arguably the greatest women's match ever, a match which ended with Bayley finally winning the women's title. That's right, it was a breakthrough moment for the women and a sign of what was to come. And it also meant that SummerSlam the following night had big shoes to fill, as it had to live up to such an excellent show. Luckily though, for the most part, this one was pretty good, as it featured the likes of Dean Ambrose and Roman Reigns defeating the Wyatt family in a tag team match, Kevin Owens getting the victory over Cesaro, Neville teaming with Arrow star Stephen Amell to beat Stardust and Wade Barrett, and Daily Show host Jon Stewart turning heel when he cost John Cena a win over Seth Rollins. Of course, this meant then that not only would the Architect walk out of the show WWE World Heavyweight Champion, but he'd also be United States Champion too. That said, even this achievement couldn't earn him the main event spot, as that was taken up by Brock Lesnar versus The Undertaker round 2. And here, while the match was mostly great, it was hampered by a questionable ending, which saw the referee miss the dead man tapping out while caught in a Kimura lock. So when he kicked the Beast and the Family Jewels moments later and got the win, the ending felt a little anticlimactic. And that was why a rubber match was assumed to be coming in the near future, but it wouldn't come at September 20th's Night of Champions though. No, on that night, the big match on the card outside of possibly Charlotte defeating Nikki Bella to win the Divas Championship was Sting returning to challenge Seth Rollins for the WWE World Heavyweight title. And this wasn't the only match the Architect had here, because as the reigning US champion too, he'd have to defend that belt against John Cena. But even if he lost to Big Match John, he was still at least able to retain against Sting, although that victory came with a sense of bitterness as, during the world title match, the Icon picked up an injury which ended his in-ring career with WWE for good. Not that Steve Borden held any grudges against Rollins for this though, as he understood it was just one of those accidents which sometimes happen when you're in the ring. And the WWE didn't hold it against the champ either, as following another WWE Network special at Madison Square Garden on October 3rd, where he took on John Cena once more, Seth prepared himself to head into Hell in a Cell, still the top guy in WWE. Before that happened though, NXT held another banger when on October 7th at TakeOver Respect, Finn Balor and Samoa Joe defeated Baron Corbin and Rhino to win the first annual Dusty Rhodes Tag Team Classic. On top of that, not only would Asuka make an early impact with a win over Dana Brooke, but for the first time in history, a WWE-produced show ended with the women going on last when Sasha Banks and Bayley went 30 minutes in an Iron Woman match. Of course, given the fact that Sasha was now on the main roster, it only made sense the Hugger would win here to retain her women's title. And after it was over, Charlotte Flair and Becky Lynch came out to celebrate with them, as NXT said goodbye for the most part to the era of the Four Horsewomen. But the Black and Gold brand's loss was the main roster's gain, as it turned out, because at Hell in a Cell on October 25th, Charlotte Flair went one-on-one with Nikki Bella again for the Divas title, and after submitting her opponent, would be able to retain here. And she wasn't the only champion retaining. No, elsewhere, the New Day defeated the recently returned Dudley Boys to keep the tag team titles around their waists. Kevin Owens got the better of Ryback in order to take the Intercontinental title back home with him, and Seth Rollins survived an onslaught from Kane in the WWE World Heavyweight title match. As for John Cena though, well, he wouldn't be so lucky because after laying out another open challenge for his United States title, he'd be surprised by returning Alberto Del Rio, with this ultimately putting him off his guard enough to the point that he dropped the belt to the Mexican star here. Of course, the real story of this show was neither of those bouts. No, the real story was the main event where inside Hell in a Cell, Brock Lesnar and The Undertaker finally settled things once and for all in what may very well have been the dead man's last great in-ring encounter. But while he certainly put up a battle worthy of his legacy here, it was the Beast who was standing tall once all was said and done, and the Phenom who was left to be carried away by the Wyatt family. So when he found out his brother had also been a victim of Bray Wyatt and his crew then, Kane stepped up to offer him some backup over the weeks which followed, and this would lead to a tag team match at November 22nd Survivor Series, which saw the Brothers of Destruction reunite to defeat Bray Wyatt and Luke Harper. Elsewhere though, plans would be far more in flux, as after Seth Rollins injured his knee at a live event in Dublin, Ireland on November 4th, he was forced to vacate the WWE World Heavyweight title. So this meant, just like with Deadly Games 17 years ago, a one-night tournament would be held to crown a new champ. Still alive in the semifinals of the tournament as the show went to air would be none other than Roman Reigns, Alberto Del Rio, Dean Ambrose, and Kevin Owens. That said, after Del Rio and Owens were eliminated early on in the night, it left just the two former Shield members left. So, while they were preparing for the main event, fans took a breather to watch on as the rest of the card saw Charlotte Flair defeat Paige to retain her Divas title. Then, once that was over, Reigns and Ambrose hit the ring for a bout which remained friendly between them despite what was on the line. Of course, fans weren't so jovial when it came to the big dog though, because pretty early on, they made it clear exactly who they wanted to see come out the victor. So when Roman won just after 9 minutes to start his first reign on top, many fans were not pleased. That was until Sheamus came down to the ring to cash in his Money in the Bank contract and steal the title away at the last minute. Yes, in a way to create sympathy for the babyface Reigns here, the title had been put on Sheamus and have him create a new heel stable around him in the form of the League of Nations. And this would lead to another showdown between the champ and his challenger at TLC Tables, Ladders, and Chairs on December 13th then, with things here being contested in a TLC match. Before that main event came around though, the undercard would have some notable moments too, as it featured Dean Ambrose defeating Kevin Owens to win the Intercontinental title, and the New Day successfully defending their tag team titles against the Usos and the Lucha Dragons in a triple threat tag team ladder match. Of course, once these bouts were over though, the focus was all on whether the big dog could overcome Sheamus. And by the end, Roman would be screwed out of the victory, after which he would lay out Triple H with a Superman punch. And this led to the traditional wrestler versus the authority angle when Vince McMahon himself got involved the next night on Raw, offering Roman a rematch but only under the condition that he act as the crooked special guest referee. In the end though, even if the boss was heavily biased towards the Irishman in this one, Reigns was able to get the win come the close in order to start his second run with the top title, and this time, he'd finally get cheered in doing so. Yes, it felt like WWE had turned a corner on their fans' relationship to their next top star. But that still wasn't the end of the year for them because, after another tribute to the Troops show, NXT headed over to the UK to put on TakeOver London, a show where not only did the Revival solidify their recent tag team title victory with a win over Enzo Amore and Big Cass, but Bayley and Finn Balor would both retain their women's and world titles against Nia Jax and Samoa Joe, respectively. Yes, what a transformative year 2015 was. By this point, in fact, you could see that WWE were now fully into the modern era, as with a whole crop of younger stars taking the reins, the PG era days seemed to be a thing of the past. 2016 was a huge year in pop culture. On Netflix, we saw the debut of Stranger Things. In music, Justin Timberlake was topping the charts with Can't Stop the Feeling. And meanwhile, over in the WWE, the new face of the company, Roman Reigns, was still trying to get over with fans, all while a legend of the industry made his long-awaited debut and rose all the way to the top of the card in record time. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWE in 2016, a year in review. When we last left off, Roman Reigns was the WWE champion and finally was starting to win a small segment of the audience over. So with Vince McMahon hoping a corner had been turned, he'd head into the first big show of the year, the Royal Rumble on January 24th, looking to get the big dog even more over by having him defend the title in the Rumble match itself. Yes, for the first time since 1992, the top prize in the company was being fought over in the titular 30-man battle royal, meaning anyone could have walked away from it as the new champion. Before we'd find out who did this, though, the undercard saw 3 champions successfully defend when Charlotte Flair retained the Divas title against Becky Lynch, Dean Ambrose got the better of Kevin Owens in an Intercontinental title last man standing match, and the New Day pinned the Usos to keep hold of their tag team gold. Then, once that was over, the main event saw Roman Reigns come out at number 1 as he'd hoped to run the entire gauntlet. Unfortunately for him, though, while this was meant to get him over as a fighting champion, the match saw most fans turn on him once more. Why was this? Well, because he spent most of it backstage with a kayfabe injury. And when he came back out towards the end, the live crowd were not on his side, with them even going as far as to cheer when he was eliminated by the surprise number 30 entrant, Triple H. And with Reigns eliminated then, it left only the Game and Dean Ambrose remaining, with Triple H coming out the winner of the match and now a 14-time world champion. That said, this wasn't the only big moment which came out of the match, because early on in the Rumble, AJ Styles made his WWE debut at the number 3 spot. But while he wouldn't win here, he would do enough to catch the eye of Chris Jericho as, over the weeks which followed, the two would enter into a feud. And that led us into February 21st's Fastlane as there, just weeks after Daniel Bryan gave a tearful farewell to fans, Charlotte Flair was beating Brie Bella in the Divas title match, the Wyatt family were losing to the Big Show, Kane, and Ryback, and Styles and Jericho went one-on-one, with this round being won by AJ. Of course, for as exciting as this was for fans to see, the real main event was still to come as there, in a triple threat match, Roman Reigns, Brock Lesnar, and Dean Ambrose fought it out to see who would challenge Triple H for the WWE title at WrestleMania. And the big dog got the winning pinfall here after almost 17 minutes. And WWE had clearly taken note of how over the lunatic Fringe was getting after this one, so this was why, at Roadblock on March 12th, he'd get to go one-on-one with the champ himself. But before we got to the main event of this one, we'd see a stacked undercard where Brock Lesnar would defeat both Bray Wyatt and Luke Harper in a handicap match, Chris Jericho go over on Jack Swagger, and Sami Zayn beat Stardust. And by the end of the night, the Game would walk out on top of his match as he defeated Ambrose by pinfall, with this officially setting up his WrestleMania showdown with Roman Reigns for the following month. Before we get to that point, though, WrestleMania weekend kicked off with TakeOver Dallas on April 1st, a show which saw American Alpha and The Revival have a classic over the NXT Tag Team titles, Asuka win the brand's women's title from Bayley, Finn Balor retain his NXT World title against Samoa Joe, and Shinsuke Nakamura make his WWE debut with a victory against Sami Zayn. Then the following night, the festivities continued when the newest Hall of Fame class were inducted, with this year seeing the likes of Sting, Stan Hansen, and the Fabulous Freebirds take their place amongst the greats. But of course, this was all set up for April 3rd because there, in front of WWE's legit biggest crowd ever, WrestleMania 32 took place. Unfortunately, though, much of the card had to be rewritten relatively last minute for this one after a plague of injuries took out the likes of Randy Orton, Seth Rollins, and John Cena. And in the case of the latter, it meant his planned bout with The Undertaker was scrapped, as instead, the Dead Man took on Shane McMahon inside of Hell in a Cell. On top of this, we'd see Brock Lesnar and Dean Ambrose go one-on-one, Zack Ryder get his moment by winning the Intercontinental title for a night, The Rock make a brief appearance to defeat Eric Rowan in an impromptu bout, and Sasha Banks, Becky Lynch, and Charlotte Flair steal the show when they went to war over the new WWE Women's Championship. After this, then, it came time for the main event where the big dog would win the big one and start his third reign as WWE Champion. And so it was then that the next night on Raw, he'd come out to speak to the crowd, only to be drowned out by an ocean of boos, as fans clearly still didn't want him as their guy. And that wasn't the only notable moment coming out of this episode of Raw, because elsewhere, despite losing his match against The Undertaker the night prior, Shane McMahon was made the new boss of Raw going forward. And in one of his first acts as boss then, he'd set up a match to announce a new #1 contender for the WWE title, a match which was won by none other than AJ Styles. So this would lead us into Payback on May 1st, where just days after Samoa Joe beat Finn Balor to win the NXT World title at a live event, Rosemont, Illinois watched on as Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn took their feud to the main roster. The Miz defend his Intercontinental title against Cesaro, and Charlotte Flair reenact the Montreal Screwjob when she scored a victory over Natalya in the women's title match. Then in the main event, Roman Reigns defended his newly won title against AJ Styles. Still, at least the Phenomenal One got another shot at May 22nd's Extreme Rules, and to make matters even more interesting here, the rematch would be held under no-holds-barred rules. Before this took place, though, the undercard saw both ends of the quality spectrum represented when The Miz, Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, and Cesaro had a blow-away fatal four-way bout for the Intercontinental title, and Chris Jericho and Dean Ambrose put on the first and only Ambrose Asylum match to date. Of course, neither of these were on fans' minds once the show was over, however, because in a shock moment, after Roman Reigns retained his WWE title against AJ Styles, Seth Rollins made his return and laid out his former Shield brother with a pedigree. Yes, the Architect was back and ready to re-enter the world title scene, but while fans were desperate to cheer for him, Rollins would be playing the role of heel instead. So with this frustrating audiences, as they felt like they weren't being heard, it left a tense atmosphere leading into June 19th's Money in the Bank, where the two former stablemates would finally face off one-on-one. Before we get there, though, NXT put on another instant classic when on June 8th they held TakeOver The End, a show which saw Shinsuke Nakamura's rise continue with a win over Austin Aries, and Samoa Joe's time with the NXT World title keep going when he beat Finn Balor in a steel cage bout. Needless to say, then, the quality of this show left the main roster pumped up to put on an even better one a few weeks later, as at Money in the Bank, not only would Dean Ambrose win the titular contract when he bested Alberto Del Rio, Cesaro, Chris Jericho, Kevin Owens, and Sami Zayn in a ladder match, but in a showdown for the ages, AJ Styles went one-on-one with John Cena and even beat him. Then, once that was over, Seth Rollins shocked the world when he defeated Roman Reigns clean. But that wasn't the end of the night, because moments later, Dean Ambrose came out to cash in his Money in the Bank contract, with his victory here meaning that all three members of the Shield would be world champion within 10 minutes of each other. So, clearly needing to settle things once and for all, a triple threat match between each would be booked for July 24th's Battleground. And to make matters even more interesting, this one would determine which brand got the WWE title exclusively going forward. Why was that? Well, on July 19th, WWE revived the brand extension. And during the first draft, the Shield were split up when Shane McMahon and Daniel Bryan picked up Ambrose for SmackDown, and both Rollins and Reigns were moved permanently over to Raw by Stephanie McMahon and Mick Foley. Not that Reigns spent much time on TV over the next month, though, because after failing a wellness policy violation, he'd be suspended for 30 days, meaning he'd miss pretty much all of the build to the big three-way match. But that wasn't the only big story heading into this show, as with AJ Styles now having turned heel, a rematch between him and John Cena was booked for the pay-per-view too. Well, sort of, because this time it would be Styles, Luke Gallows, and Carl Anderson taking on Cena, Big Cass, and Enzo Amore in a trios bout. Elsewhere, meanwhile, Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens hoped to put their years-long feud to bed when they went one-on-one once more, with Zayn ending up coming out of this one the victor. And once that was done, the stage would be clear for the main event, as there, in the long-awaited Shield triple threat, Dean Ambrose ended up getting the pin, with him taking the WWE title to SmackDown with him as a result. So, needing a new world title of their own, Raw announced the debut of the Universal title the next night, with this one to be fought over by the top two contenders, Seth Rollins, and new main roster call-up Finn Balor at SummerSlam. But that wasn't the only big news coming out of this edition of the Red Brand, because elsewhere, Sasha Banks finally reached the top of the mountain when she beat Charlotte Flair to win the now rebranded Raw Women's title. And that led us into SummerSlam on August 21st, as there, just a day after TakeOver Brooklyn 2 saw the Revival regain the NXT Tag Team titles against DIY, and Shinsuke Nakamura winning the brand's world title from Samoa Joe, Sasha and Charlotte had the rematch, with the Queen this time coming out the champion. Elsewhere on the card, meanwhile, Chris Jericho and Kevin Owens' bromance began when they teamed up to take on Big Cass and Enzo Amore. AJ Styles scored a massive clean pinfall over John Cena in the match of the night, and Brock Lesnar beat Randy Orton by referee stoppage via elbows to the head. But while this was a big win for the Beast following his return from a fight he had at UFC 200, the night didn't end so well for Finn Balor, because despite beating Seth Rollins to become the inaugural Universal Champion, he'd injure his shoulder in the process, with this meaning he'd sadly have to vacate the belt the next night on Raw. So needing a new champ quickly then, a fatal four-way match was booked the following week between Rollins, Kevin Owens, Roman Reigns, and Big Cass. And to the shock of many fans here, it was KO who walked out with the belt when the Architect's mentor Triple H turned on him and cost him the victory. That said, for as much anticipation as this created for Raw's next big pay-per-view, fans would have to wait for that because it was SmackDown's turn first when they held Backlash in September. And here, looking to upstage their rival brand, the Shane McMahon and Daniel Bryan helmed show put on a card which saw Becky Lynch become the inaugural SmackDown Women's Champion after winning a six-pack elimination challenge, Heath Slater get a blue brand contract when he and Rhino beat the Usos to win the SmackDown Tag Team titles, and most notably, AJ Styles dethroned Dean Ambrose to become WWE Champion after less than a year on the roster. Yes, so impressed was Vince McMahon with the phenomenal one, he'd chosen to give him the ball to run with. But the new champ would have to wait for his first big title defense, because before that, the Cruiserweight Classic, a tournament which saw one-time WWE appearances from the likes of Kota Ibushi and Zack Sabre Jr., held its finals on September 14th, with TJ Perkins coming out the overall winner and new Cruiserweight champion. Then, once that was over, Raw returned to pay-per-view on September 25th when they held Clash of Champions. And on this show, not only would Roman Reigns win the United States title from Rusev, but Kevin Owens would retain the Universal title during his showdown with the now babyface Seth Rollins, and Charlotte Flair would manage to keep hold of the Raw Women's title when she beat both Sasha Banks and a now main roster Bayley. But given Banks hadn't been pinned during this one, she'd demand a rematch the next night on Raw, and when she got this, she'd beat the Queen again to officially become a two-time women's champion. Not that this title run would last for long, however, because at Raw's next pay-per-view, Hell in a Cell, she'd drop it right back to Flair again. Before this happened, though, it was SmackDown's turn as they held No Mercy on October 9th, and on this show, the main matches would see Bray Wyatt score a big-time victory over Randy Orton, The Miz, and Dolph Ziggler create a hidden gem, and the WWE title be put on the line in a triple threat match between AJ Styles, Dean Ambrose, and John Cena. Despite the two babyfaces putting on their best efforts, however, it was the phenomenal one who retained here, so while he began preparing for his next challenger, it was over to Raw, where on October 30th, they held Hell in a Cell. But while this was headlined by the first ever women's cell bout between Sasha Banks and Charlotte Flair, it wasn't the only big match on this show. No, aside from this, there was also Roman Reigns retaining the United States belt against Rusev, Brian Kendrick winning the Cruiserweight title from TJ Perkins, and Kevin Owens successfully walking away from his own Hell in a Cell bout against Seth Rollins, still the Universal Champion. Yes, proving he was more than just a paper champ here, KO was able to rack up another big-time victory. And even if he did have more than a little help from his kayfabe best friend Chris Jericho in doing so, it didn't change the fact he was still on top. That said, at the next big pay-per-view, Survivor Series on November 20th, he wouldn't have to worry about defending his belt, as instead it was time for brand warfare when Raw and SmackDown went at it in a series of bouts. Of course, the night before this took place though, no such brand differences were at play because that was when NXT held another stellar show with TakeOver Toronto, a show which saw DIY dethrone tag team champions The Revival in a classic 2 out of 3 falls encounter, Asuka get the better of a returning Mickie James in the women's title bout, Kona Reeves and Rich Swann end in a no contest, Bobby Roode defeat Ty Dillinger, and Samoa Joe become the first ever two-time world champion on the brand when he handed Shinsuke Nakamura his first loss in NXT. But for as great as this show was, nothing on it quite had the big fight feel of Survivor Series the following evening, as there, in the main event, Goldberg returned to WWE after having spent 12 years away in order to face off against Brock Lesnar. And in one of the most shocking moments in recent memory, not only did he defeat the Beast, but he did so by absolutely squashing him in less than 90 seconds in one of the greatest short matches of all time. Yes, for the first time since ending The Undertaker's streak at WrestleMania 30, Lesnar came out the definitive loser and in the process was left to retreat and lick his wounds. But that wasn't the only notable moment which came out of this show, because elsewhere on the undercard, Randy Orton's newfound turn to the dark side was being solidified when he helped Bray Wyatt score the overall victory during the men's 5-on-5 traditional Survivor Series elimination match. That's right, in the weeks leading up to this, the Wyatt family had taken a keen interest in the Viper and had begun the process of indoctrinating him into their stable. But while this was disappointing for longtime fans of Orton, something which wasn't disappointing was seeing Sasha Banks get another shot at Charlotte Flair on the November 28th episode of Raw a couple of weeks later, where she once again defeated the Queen to become a 3-time women's champion. Meanwhile, as this was happening over on SmackDown, James Ellsworth was being given an official blue brand contract after scoring a fluke win over WWE champion AJ Styles. and this meant he'd be in Dean Ambrose's corner when the Lunatic Fringe challenged AJ for the belt at December 4th's TLC Tables, Ladders, and Chairs pay-per-view. That said, rather than help his supposed buddy here, Ellsworth actually cost Ambrose the victory, with his reasoning being he wanted a shot at the gold himself, and since he'd already beaten Styles once, he felt confident he could do so again. But while Ambrose didn't win the title back here, elsewhere on this show, plenty of other belts would change hands, as not only did Randy Orton and Bray Wyatt dethrone SmackDown Tag Team Champions Heath Slater and Rhino, but Alexa Bliss won the big one when she put Becky Lynch through a table in order to become the new SmackDown Women's Champion. And with this being the last SmackDown exclusive show of the year, it meant she'd go into January of 2017 still holding on to this belt. As far as Raw's women's division was concerned, however, things were still very much in flux, as following another Tribute to the Troops show on December 14th, Charlotte Flair was able to regain the Raw women's title again when she beat Sasha Banks at Roadblock End of the Line just 4 days later. So thankfully, the belt began to stabilize for a while after this, and it was also at this time that the bromance between Kevin Owens and Chris Jericho was really getting over with fans. And that was why, when KO defended his Universal title against Roman Reigns at this show, the heel duo were largely cheered over the babyface. Hell, even after Owens won via screwy means, the live crowd rained down love upon him. And when Seth Rollins ran to his former stablemate's aid following that, people weren't having any of it, as they gave Roman a less than fond farewell while he was leaving the ringside area. But at least others were having a better time of things, because in the undercard, Cesaro and Sheamus became tag team champions when they beat the New Day for the honor. Sami Zayn would technically win a match against Braun Strowman by surviving a 10-minute time limit against him. And on top of that, Rich Swann would reign supreme as Cruiserweight champion when he scored a victory over Brian Kendrick. That said, even if Neville was now staking his claim at that very belt, it remained undeniable the Cruiserweight division was struggling. The bigger problem was still the fact that few fans were behind Roman Reigns as the company's top babyface. Could he turn things around? That remained to be seen. One thing which was for certain, though, was that it wouldn't be happening this year, as with the only other notable moment of the month coming on December 28th when Shinsuke Nakamura regained the NXT World title from Samoa Joe, this marked the end of 2016. Yes, this one was a great year for WWE, as with Kevin Owens and Chris Jericho stealing the show every week on Raw, AJ Styles as the WWE Champion over on SmackDown, and NXT on fire, there truly was something for everyone. 2017 was a huge year in pop culture. In the world of film, Star Wars Episode 8 would hit theaters. In music, Ed Sheeran was topping the charts with Shape of You. Meanwhile, in the WWE, Roman Reigns was still trying to get over as the next face of the company. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWE in 2017, a year in review. When we last left off, AJ Styles was riding high as the WWE Champion on SmackDown, and Kevin Owens was not only the Universal Champion on Raw, but was also in the midst of an all-time great storyline with Chris Jericho. And that would normally lead us into the first big main roster show of the year, but this year, instead, there was a couple of things to come first, as on January 14th and 15th, WWE crowned their first ever United Kingdom Champion in a tournament which included the likes of Jordan Devlin, Trent Seven, and Pete Dunne, but which was eventually won by Tyler Bate. Then after that, NXT held TakeOver San Antonio on January 28th, another blow-away show for the developmental brand, which saw the Authors of Pain win the tag team titles from DIY, Asuka retain her women's title in a fatal four-way match against Nikki Cross, Billie Kay, and Peyton Royce, and Bobby Roode become the new NXT World Champion after dethroning Shinsuke Nakamura in the main event. So with big shoes to fill, then the main roster went all in the following evening when they held the Royal Rumble, and there gave fans a card which not only saw Kevin Owens and Charlotte Flair both retain their Universal and Raw women's belts respectively, but also John Cena have an all-time great moment when he would win his 16th world title after defeating AJ Styles, with him now tied with Ric Flair in the record books. But for as big of a moment as that was, it wasn't the main focus of the show once it was over, because in the Rumble match itself, lots of storyline progression took place when Goldberg eliminated Brock Lesnar, embarrassing him for the second time in the process, and Roman Reigns eliminated The Undertaker to set up their own WrestleMania showdown. Still, it wouldn't be the big dog who won the bout, because he was eventually thrown over the top rope by overall victor and newest Wyatt family recruit, Randy Orton. So with the Viper now booking himself a shot at the WWE title at the Showcase of the Immortals, the only question left was who would he be facing? Sure, John Cena was the champion heading out of the Rumble, but he'd still have to defend this title once more at February 12th's Elimination Chamber. Of course, he wouldn't be the only one set to defend a belt there though, because on the undercard of the Blue Brand exclusive show, while American Alpha were keeping hold of their tag team titles after a war against the Ascension, Alexa Bliss was losing her SmackDown Women's title to Naomi. That said, the big story was all on the main event where, inside the titular chamber, Big Match John put the WWE title on the line against AJ Styles, Dean Ambrose, The Miz, Baron Corbin, and the man who had come out of the evening the new top dog on the show, Bray Wyatt. Yes, after a run of ups and downs, the Eater of Worlds had finally won the gold. But with Randy Orton being the Royal Rumble winner, this meant a crack had now formed within the Wyatt family. Before we'd find out the next stage of that angle though, another even bigger moment came when, after Chris Jericho got a little too excited during a confrontation between Kevin Owens and Goldberg on Raw a few weeks prior, he'd make the challenge on his best friend's behalf for a Universal title match to take place at the big show. So realizing he'd gone too far then, Y2J hosted one of the greatest segments of all time when on February 14th he gave us the Festival of Friendship. Unfortunately though, for as great as this was at showing the epic bromance between the two Canadians, it all ended in tragedy when KO added Jericho to his own list and then laid him out as revenge for the match he'd volunteered him for. But even if this made the champ feel a little better, he'd still have to face off against Goldberg at March 5th's Raw exclusive show Fastlane. And there, predictably, after trying to dodge the former WCW star for as long as possible, he'd end up losing his prized Universal title to him. Of course, this wasn't the only big moment which took place here though, because elsewhere on the card, Samoa Joe made a convincing first impression on the main roster with a win over Sami Zayn, and after having dethroned Charlotte Flair for the Raw Women's title a few weeks prior, Bayley successfully defended against the Queen on pay-per-view. That said, this wouldn't be the last time the two were on opposite sides of the ring from each other, because at WrestleMania 33 on April 2nd, they'd both be part of a fatal four-way match. Before we'd get there though, the newest Hall of Fame class saw inductions for the likes of Kurt Angle, Diamond Dallas Page, and Rick Rude. Then after that, NXT held another banger when at TakeOver Orlando on April 1st, Aleister Black got the better of Andrade Cien Almas, Asuka fended off the challenge of Ember Moon, and Bobby Roode successfully defended his NXT World Championship against Shinsuke Nakamura. And just 24 hours later, the Showcase of the Immortals arrived once more too when, in front of a packed Florida crowd, the night started out with AJ Styles beating Shane McMahon, Bayley successfully defending her Raw Women's title against Charlotte Flair, Sasha Banks and Nia Jax, and Kevin Owens defeat Chris Jericho. And after that, the Hardy Boys made their triumphant return to WWE by winning the Raw Tag Team titles. John Cena proposed to Nikki Bella after they defeated The Miz and Maurice, and Seth Rollins finally got his revenge over Triple H by pinning him in the middle of the ring. Then in the main events, Brock Lesnar and Goldberg ended their program with maybe the best 5-minute match ever. Randy Orton returned to the side of the good guys to end the brief WWE title reign of Bray Wyatt, and in the last bout of the evening, The Undertaker lost to Roman Reigns. Yes, despite fan backlash, it was clear that WWE were now all in on Roman as a top guy again. And this would only be further proven at April 30th's Payback pay-per-view, as there, in the main event of the Raw exclusive show, the Big Dog faced off against Braun Strowman. Elsewhere, meanwhile, this show saw Chris Jericho get his win back over Kevin Owens, the newly drafted Alexa Bliss win the Red Brand's women's title from Bayley, and Bray Wyatt take on Randy Orton in a House of Horrors match. Meanwhile, over on NXT, just a few weeks later, they'd hold TakeOver Chicago, a show which featured Pete Dunne winning the United Kingdom title from Tyler Bate, Bobby Roode dispatching another challenger in the form of Hideo Itami, and DIY finally exploding when, following a loss to the Authors of Pain, Tommaso Ciampa turned on his partner Johnny Gargano and kicked off possibly the greatest storyline in Black and Gold brand history. And back over on the main roster, the next night SmackDown held Backlash with the card made up of Kevin Owens and AJ Styles, the final collapse of the Wyatt family when Luke Harper defeated Eric Rowan, and the most shocking world title change in modern history when Jinder Mahal defeated Randy Orton to win the top prize. Yes, after spending his entire career as a lower card jobber, Jinder was now the champ, and with Universal title holder Brock Lesnar being AWOL, this made him the de facto best in the company. Meanwhile, over on the Raw brand, we saw June 4th's Extreme Rules, a show which saw The Miz win the Intercontinental title from Dean Ambrose, The Bar become Raw Tag Team Champions after dethroning the Hardy Boys, and Bayley lose to Alexa Bliss in a kendo stick on a pole match. And after this, a Universal title match was set up when Samoa Joe beat Roman Reigns, Finn Balor, Seth Rollins, and Bray Wyatt to become #1 contender to Brock. Before that bout took place, however, SmackDown returned to pay-per-view on June 18th for Money in the Bank, where in the first ever women's version of the titular match, Carmella got the better of Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, Natalya, and Tamina, all with a little help from James Ellsworth, of course. And meanwhile, in the men's Money in the Bank match, Baron Corbin would come out on top. Then the rest of the card was filled out with Jinder Mahal retaining his WWE title against Randy Orton in the rematch between the two. After this came the Raw exclusive show on July 9th, Great Balls of Fire, where fans watched as Braun Strowman and Roman Reigns continued their feud in an ambulance match. The Miz retained his IC strap over Dean Ambrose, and Sasha Banks failed to win the Raw Women's title from Alexa Bliss. Also, The Bar had a great Iron Man bout with the Hardy Boys, and Samoa Joe proved he was worthy of the main event spot during an awesome bout between him and Brock Lesnar. But for as great as he was here, the Samoan submission machine wasn't able to beat the champ, and so Lesnar's reign would continue on into the summer. Not that this was the last time the two met in the ring, of course. It was just that the next time they did, there would be other bodies in play too. Before we look at this, however, we have to shift back over to SmackDown, as on July 23rd they held Battleground, and there, in front of a rabid Philadelphia crowd, John Cena and Rusev rekindled their feud with a flag match, all while elsewhere, Natalya was becoming #1 contender to Naomi's SmackDown Women's title, Shinsuke Nakamura was picking up a win over Baron Corbin, and Jinder Mahal was once again defeating Randy Orton, this time in a Punjabi prison bout. Then, once that was over, it was full steam ahead to SummerSlam weekend as things kicked off on August 19th with TakeOver Brooklyn 3, a show which saw Tommaso Ciampa watch on from the injury shelf as Johnny Gargano fell further into a pit of despair with a loss to Andrade Cien Almas. But that wasn't all which was happening on this show, because elsewhere, Sanity became the new tag team champions after defeating the Authors of Pain, Asuka retained her women's title once more against Ember Moon, and Drew McIntyre made his triumphant return to WWE by winning the NXT World title from Bobby Roode. Yes, it was quite a moment, and one which left the main roster with another tough act to live up to. So it's just as well then that SummerSlam the following evening turned out to be a great show too. But what made this one worth watching? Well, for starters, there were the two women's title changes when Natalya and Sasha Banks won the SmackDown and Raw straps respectively. Then, as if that wasn't enough, the Shield sort of reunited when Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins partnered up to win the Raw Tag Team titles from The Bar, Finn Balor reintroduced the Demon in order to get the win over Bray Wyatt, and Brock Lesnar won a very entertaining Fatal 4-Way match for the Universal title against Roman Reigns, Samoa Joe, and Braun Strowman. Of course, that wasn't the only men's world title on the line this night though, because in the other main event, after dispatching of Baron Corbin and his failed Money in the Bank cash-in attempt just days prior, Jinder Mahal was able to beat Shinsuke Nakamura to retain the top prize over on the Blue brand. Yes, if you'd told fans a couple of years before this that Nakamura was going to fail in his attempts to beat Jinder Mahal for the WWE title, they probably never would have seen it coming. And they would have probably stared at you in complete disbelief if you'd also told them that, in order to earn this title shot, Nakamura had defeated John Cena in a dream match on an episode of SmackDown just a few weeks prior. But reality is often weird and unpredictable. Just ask Sasha Banks, because a mere 8 days after winning the Raw Women's title from Alexa Bliss, she'd drop it right back to the goddess on the August 28th episode of Raw, with this only continuing her unfortunate tradition of never being able to successfully defend a belt. Maybe she should have been taking notes from Shayna Baszler then, as on September 12th, she'd proved to be a dominating force when she beat Kairi Sane in the finals of the first ever Mae Young Classic, an all-women's tournament which featured a variety of talent from all over the world, such as Rhea Ripley, Toni Storm, Serena Deeb, Tessa Blanchard, and Bianca Belair, just to name a few. That said, Banks likely didn't have much time to watch this anyways, as she instead had to focus on her rematch at September 24th's No Mercy, where on the orders of Raw General Manager Kurt Angle, she, Bayley, Emma, and Nia Jax, and champ Alexa Bliss would all take part in a fatal 5-way match for the title. And that wasn't the only big moment coming out of this show, because after the goddess successfully retained, fans got to see Cesaro literally knock his teeth out during his and Sheamus's match against Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins. Brock Lesnar retained the Universal title against Braun Strowman, Enzo Amore become the Cruiserweight Champion after beating Neville, and in a bout which was WrestleMania main event worthy, John Cena attempted to pass the torch to new face of the company, Roman Reigns, in a moment which many fans still refuse to get behind. But for as much as the crowd weren't getting into Roman still, at least they were getting into what Kevin Owens was doing over on SmackDown, as his one-man war on the McMahon family had seen him go so far as to headbutt Vince McMahon on live TV. And that led to the main event of October 8th's Hell in a Cell then, where, inside of the titular cage, KO faced off against Shane. And by the end, after saving his best friend from certain doom, Sami Zayn turned heel and reinvigorated his character. And he wasn't the only character being reinvigorated on this show. No, elsewhere 2 new champions were crowned when Baron Corbin defeated AJ Styles and Ty Dillinger to become the United States champion. And in a match of the year contender, the Usos beat the New Day inside of Hell in a Cell to take home the SmackDown Tag Team titles. Yes, new dawns were being forged everywhere on the Blue brand, and with Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn now being united in their battle against authority figures Shane McMahon and Daniel Bryan, it meant there was also a hot angle to see them through the rest of the year. So feeling the need to up their own game too then, Raw played their biggest card soon after this when The Shield was finally reunited. But as with all Shield reunions, this one turned out to be cursed because in the lead up to their match against Braun Strowman, The Miz, Kane, Cesaro, and Sheamus at October 22nd's TLC Tables, Ladders, and Chairs, Roman Reigns had to be pulled from competition due to him contracting the mumps. And he wasn't the only person who missed this show for the same reason. No, Bray Wyatt, someone who was supposed to face off against Finn Balor in a Demon vs. Sister Abigail match, also contracted the mumps prior to the show, and so had to be replaced by AJ Styles instead. Of course, this was a blessing in disguise when it came to the latter example though, as we all got to see a dream showing between the first 2 leaders of the Bullet Club. And in terms of the multi-man main event, well, there was also a great substitute there, because in Roman's absence, Kurt Angle came out of retirement and wrestled in a WWE ring for the first time in 11 years. Elsewhere, meanwhile, the rest of the card would see new Raw call-up Asuka make short work of Emma, and Jason Jordan, someone who had only just been revealed as the secret son of the Olympic hero, get a win over Elias to help establish himself as a single star going forward. Yes, now a Red Brand act full-time, Jordan was going to have to get used to being separated from his American Alpha partner Chad Gable, especially as in November, there would be no room for civil communication between the shows. No, this month, it was all about brand warfare, as November 19th Survivor Series pitted Raw and SmackDown against each other in a series of bouts to see which one was better. Meanwhile, over on NXT, they had a pretty big show the night before when at TakeOver War Games, the Dusty Rhodes-created classic bout was brought in for the first time in a Vince McMahon-owned ring, as a 3-way situation saw Sanity take on the Authors of Pain and the newly formed Undisputed Era. And it was in this match that the UE reached their final form, as while going in, they were only made up of Bobby Fish, Kyle O'Reilly, and former 3-time Ring of Honor World Champion Adam Cole. By the end, Roderick Strong would switch his allegiances to them as well, as he helped the now 4-man group secure the victory. But that wasn't the only big news coming out of this show, as in the undercard, Ember Moon defeated Kairi Sane, Nikki Cross, and Peyton Royce to win the NXT Women's title that Asuka vacated due to injury, all before moving up to the main roster. Then, as if that wasn't enough, not only did Aleister Black take on the Velveteen Dream in a big-time grudge match, but Andrade Cien Almas, with a little help from his managers Lena Vega, dethroned Drew McIntyre to win the NXT World title. Yes, at this time, it looked like Andrade had huge potential to be a main event player in WWE. Needless to say then, Survivor Series the following night had big shoes to fill, and in order to fill them, Vince McMahon decided to make some last-minute changes to the card when on the SmackDown before, AJ Styles beat Jinder Mahal to become a 2-time WWE champion. Why was this done so abruptly? Well, as the pay-per-view was pitting the brand's champions against each other, it now meant that instead of seeing Brock Lesnar versus Jinder, we'd get to see the dream match of the Beast versus the Phenomenal One. And this certainly lived up to expectations, as the two tore the house down for the 15 minutes they had, with it blowing away everything else on the card. Not that there wasn't anything else worth watching here though, as aside from the World Champions showdown, The Shield faced off against the New Day, the Usos took on The Bar in a Tag Team Champions versus Tag Team Champions match, and Alexa Bliss and Charlotte Flair battled it out to see who was the top women's champion in WWE. But all this really earned, or the victors in the end, were bragging rights because, with the two shows being separated again in December, there wasn't much storyline advancement to be found here. No, for that, we'd have to wait until the final big show of the year, December 17th's Clash of Champions, as there, not long after both a tribute to the Troops show and a special Starrcade-like event took place, SmackDown closed out the year by having AJ Styles defeat Jinder Mahal in the rematch between the two. Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn continue to be a thorn in their boss's side when they picked up a win over Randy Orton and Shinsuke Nakamura. And Dolph Ziggler win the United States Championship by beating Baron Corbin and the now called-up Bobby Roode in a triple threat match. Not that this reign would last for long, however, as just days later, Ziggler came out on TV to relinquish the belt and apparently quit WWE altogether. Why was this? Well, that was never really made clear, and the fact he'd be back in a month's time with no further explanation didn't really help to make it any more understandable. But as that happened in January, we guess it's a story to be talked about in more detail another day, because when it comes to 2017, this marked the end of the line. And it certainly had been an interesting year, one where, with the brand extension now firmly established, people like Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, and AJ Styles were all getting more opportunities than they likely would have otherwise. 2018 was a year of huge moments. Yes, whether it was Marvel's Avengers Infinity War dominating the box office or the royal wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, it felt like every month something big was happening. And of course, the WWE was no different, because it was here that we saw the return of a former champion, the sad vacating of a world title, and the rise of one of the biggest women's stars in history. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWE in 2018, a year in review. When we last left off, Brock Lesnar was the Universal Champion on Raw, AJ Styles was the WWE Champion over on SmackDown, Roman Reigns was still struggling to get over with fans, and Dolph Ziggler was about to change the game forever after having vacated the United States title in late December. At least, that's what he wanted us to believe. But in truth, he'd end up coming back at the Royal Rumble on January 28th in the most unceremonious fashion possible, with him spending only a few minutes in the match before being eliminated. Before we get to that match in more detail though, we first have to jump over to NXT, because the night prior to this, they held another classic as TakeOver Philadelphia saw Ember Moon retain her women's title against Shayna Baszler, Aleister Black beat Adam Cole in a brutal street fight, and Andrade Cien Almas go to war with Johnny Gargano in a match of the year contender over the Black and Gold brand's world title. But despite Johnny Wrestling's best efforts here, once the bout was over, he'd be beaten. And to make matters worse, as he was leaving the ringside area after the fact, Tommaso Ciampa returned from injury and proceeded to lay his old tag team partner out. Yes, possibly the greatest feud in NXT history was now really getting going, but that wasn't the end of the weekend's highlights, because at the Royal Rumble the following evening, the card featured two triple threat world title matches when AJ Styles retained over Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn, and Brock Lesnar got the better of Braun Strowman and Kane. Then, in the men's Rumble match, Shinsuke Nakamura outlasted the likes of John Cena, Seth Rollins, and Roman Reigns to become the first Japanese-born star to win. And he wouldn't be the only performer from the land of the rising sun to walk away with a title shot by the time the night was over, because after that, in the first ever Women's Royal Rumble, Asuka overcame Sasha Banks, Becky Lynch, and both Bella Twins to book her spot at the Showcase of the Immortals. Of course, for as big of a moment as this was though, that wasn't the end of the surprises, as well the Empress of Tomorrow stood in the ring with the Raw and SmackDown Women's Champions Alexa Bliss and Charlotte Flair. Following the bout, Joan Jett's bad reputation started playing over the loudspeakers to herald the debut of former UFC Bantamweight champion Ronda Rousey. Yes, the most dangerous unarmed woman on the planet was now a WWE roster member, but Asuka, Bliss, and Flair needn't have worried about her quite yet, because before she went after any titles, Rousey would first have to take care of some business with the McMahons. And the next major step in this story took place at February 25th's Raw exclusive show Elimination Chamber, as there, after Kurt Angle accidentally let slip that Triple H and Stephanie McMahon were planning to manipulate the baddest woman on the planet due to her embarrassing them at WrestleMania the year prior, Rousey challenged the pair to a tag team match the following month. As well as this, we saw the pay-per-view debut of Woken Matt Hardy, and Roman Reigns earning the #1 contendership spot to Brock Lesnar's Universal title. After that, we saw the SmackDown exclusive pay-per-view Fastlane, where Randy Orton won the US title from Bobby Roode, Charlotte Flair retained her SmackDown Women's title against Ruby Riott, and AJ Styles fended off the challenge of John Cena, Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, Dolph Ziggler, and Baron Corbin to keep hold of his WWE title. Then, just a week after Raw hosted the Ultimate Deletion match on March 19th, Daniel Bryan showed up on SmackDown to announce he was medically cleared to come out of retirement once more, and that he would be doing so at the next pay-per-view. Yes, it was the moment fans had been waiting for, something many thought would never actually happen. But before the American Dragon made his triumphant comeback, WrestleMania weekend started on April 6th with Goldberg, Jeff Jarrett, and the Dudley Boys being amongst the newest inductees into the WWE Hall of Fame. Then the next night, TakeOver New Orleans saw Adam Cole become the inaugural North American champion in a classic six-man ladder match, Shayna Baszler win the NXT Women's title from Ember Moon, Aleister Black become the new NXT World Champion after pinning Andrade Cien Almas, and Johnny Gargano get a measure of revenge over Tommaso Ciampa in what was probably the bout of the weekend. But it wasn't the end of the weekend though, because the night after that, WrestleMania 34 kicked off in front of a packed Louisiana crowd with Seth Rollins defeating The Miz and Finn Balor in a hugely underrated showing over the Intercontinental Championship. And things only got better from there, because after that, Charlotte Flair ended Asuka's undefeated streak in one of the greatest women's matches ever seen. Ronda Rousey had a blow-away rookie showing when, alongside Kurt Angle, she beat Triple H and Stephanie McMahon, and then The Undertaker returned from an apparent retirement to get a quick win over John Cena. But even this wasn't all, because following on from there, Daniel Bryan came out of retirement himself to partner up with Shane McMahon as the two went on to defeat Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn. After this, AJ Styles and Shinsuke Nakamura had a solid WWE title match, with AJ coming out the victor, and Braun Strowman won the Raw Tag Team titles with an 8-year-old boy called Nicholas, all before Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar main evented once more. But this time there was no Seth Rollins coming down to the ring for the swerve ending. No, here the big dog and Brock would go one-on-one, with Lesnar coming out the surprise winner come the end of the match. And as the show went off the air, then fans continued to boo Reigns right out of the building, and continued their boo even more the next night on Raw. Yes, it was obvious that at this time, the crowd were still just not into Roman as a main eventer. Next up on April 27th, WWE hosted their first ever Saudi show when we had the Greatest Royal Rumble. And here we saw a great steel cage match between Brock Lesnar and Roman Reigns, The Undertaker defeat Rusev, Seth Rollins retain his Intercontinental title in a fatal four-way match against The Miz, Finn Balor, and Samoa Joe, all before the main event that saw the biggest Royal Rumble match in history take place. That's right, 50 men would enter here, with the bout going on for 1 hour and 17 minutes, and Braun Strowman being crowned winner by the end of the night. Then over on SmackDown the following week, after Paige was announced as the new general manager of the brand on account of Daniel Bryan's return to the ring, the Iconics made their main roster debut and helped distract Charlotte Flair for long enough that Carmella was able to successfully cash in her Money in the Bank contract on her. Of course, the Queen still had her rematch clause though, and she would choose to execute this at May 6th's Backlash. But even here, despite her best efforts, she was unable to win her title back from the Staten Island Princess. And she wasn't the only challenger failing on this night, as elsewhere, while Alexa Bliss was falling to new Raw Women's Champion Nia Jax, and Shinsuke Nakamura's return bout with AJ Styles over the WWE title was ending in a double disqualification, Samoa Joe was finding himself unable to get the better of Roman Reigns. Yes, Vince McMahon was once more all in on the big dog as his top guy. Meanwhile, on NXT, we'd see TakeOver Chicago 2, where not only did the Undisputed Era's Kyle O'Reilly and Bobby Fish successfully defend their tag team titles against Danny Burch and Oney Lorcan, but Aleister Black got the better of Lars Sullivan in the world title bout. Then, once this was over, the main event saw round 2 take place between Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa, and it was in this one that after DDTing his opponent onto the exposed wooden floorboards underneath the ring mat, the Blackheart was able to even things up at 1 apiece. Yes, the feud would continue, much to the delight of fans, of course. And after that, we moved on to Money in the Bank the next night, as there, after a returning Bobby Lashley made short work of Sami Zayn, Daniel Bryan would take on Big Cass, and AJ Styles and Shinsuke Nakamura continued their feud when the champ this time beat the challenger in a last man standing match. And after Braun Strowman and Alexa Bliss became Mr. and Mrs. Money in the Bank respectively, the Goddess cashed in her briefcase later that same night to not only beat Nia Jax for the belt, but also to screw original challenger Ronda Rousey out of it in the process. And while this would lead to Ronda looking for revenge a few months later, the first woman to get her shot at taking on Alexa would be former champ Jax at July 15th's Extreme Rules instead. Unfortunately for her though, she wouldn't be able to win her gold back in this one, just as Asuka would be unable to win the SmackDown Women's title from Carmella later in the show. And the male challengers weren't having much better luck either, as it happened, because not only did Rusev fail to beat AJ Styles for the WWE title, but in the main event of the night, Seth Rollins lost an awesome 30-minute Iron Man match against Intercontinental Champion Dolph Ziggler by a score of 5-4. Meanwhile, back over in the developmental brand, things were heating up, as just 3 days later, the NXT United Kingdom Championship tournament returned. And it was there that after beating Jack Gallagher, Flash Morgan Webster, and Travis Banks in successive rounds, Zach Gibson earned himself a shot at Pete Dunne's United Kingdom title. But while Gibson wouldn't win this subsequent match, he could at least take some solace in the fact that he'd be one of the star attractions of NXT UK's weekly show once it began airing soon thereafter. And as far as the US branch went, well, that was still in a very good spot too, as it was being carried by an all-time great feud between Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa. So of course, when Ciampa won the NXT World title from Aleister Black on the July 18th episode of their weekly show, it meant round 3 between the former DIY teammates at August 18th's TakeOver Brooklyn 4 would be for all the marbles. And while the obvious ending was for the babyface to get the big win here, in the end things took yet another twist when Ciampa retained, and just a few weeks later, Gargano underwent a soft heel turn by laying out Aleister Black. That's right, while Ricochet and Kairi Sane were starting their runs as North American and NXT Women's Champion respectively, the Black and Gold brand's top program was only adding further shades of gray to its palette. Meanwhile, however, as far as the main roster, at August 19th SummerSlam, after a show which saw the Revival lose to the B Team and Charlotte Flair steal Becky Lynch's thunder at the last minute by winning the SmackDown Women's title from Carmella, the Roman Reigns vs. Brock Lesnar feud saw its next chapter take place when the Big Dog finally toppled the Beast to win the Universal Championship. Elsewhere on the show, not only did Ronda Rousey beat Alexa Bliss to become Raw Women's Champion, and Dean Ambrose returned from injury to stand in Seth Rollins' corner during his bout against Dolph Ziggler, but Daniel Bryan and The Miz would finally take their rivalry to the ring once more. And even if The Miz won this one, it was clear based on the finish that things weren't over between the two yet, just as it soon became clear things weren't over between Becky Lynch and Charlotte Flair, as after apparently turning heel when she laid out the Queen, the Irish woman morphed into The Man, a modern-day Stone Cold type character who quickly became a mega hit with fans. Yes, seeing her as the one who'd been wronged in this situation given the fact she'd spent months working her way up the ranks only for Flair to then get a title shot immediately upon her return, audiences everywhere refused to boo Becky. So because of this, WWE decided to quickly change plans as she instead became the biggest anti-hero we've seen in years. Next, we saw September 16th's Hell in a Cell, a show which saw the main event bout end in a no contest when Brock Lesnar interfered right as Roman Reigns was about to get the better of Braun Strowman. Elsewhere on the card, not only did AJ Styles and Samoa Joe have a great match for the WWE title, and Randy Orton defeat Jeff Hardy inside of the Cell, but Becky Lynch would finally win the SmackDown Women's title after beating Charlotte Flair. And it was also around this time that the first ever all-women's show was announced, WWE Evolution. That's right, it was finally time for the females to get their time to shine, as by now the Four Horsewomen and others had built up such a name for themselves they were able to carry an entire show on their own. Before we get there though, another international special took place when on October 6th, Super Showdown was held in Melbourne, Australia. And it was there that not only did Daniel Bryan finally get his victory over The Miz, and The Shield briefly reunite once more to take out Braun Strowman, Dolph Ziggler, and Drew McIntyre, but Triple H and The Undertaker had one final singles bout together with Shawn Michaels and Kane in their respective corners. Of course, we say singles bout here because this wasn't the end of the program. No, just a month later, things would continue on, in fact, with this one being a tag team bout which saw the Heartbreak Kid actually come out of retirement. Before that happened, however, shockwaves were sent through the industry when on the October 22nd episode of Raw, Roman Reigns announced he was having to vacate the Universal title on account of serious illness. Yes, it was a truly stunning moment and one of the saddest of recent memory. That said, the show would continue on as later on during that very same episode of TV, Dean Ambrose turned heel on Seth Rollins to fully end the Shield once more. And with Roman now out for the foreseeable future, Becky Lynch was one of the company's rising stars right there to pick up his mantle, because at October 28th's all-women's pay-per-view Evolution, the man stole the show during a last woman standing match against Charlotte Flair. Not that this was the only big moment of the night, however, as aside from it, Shayna Baszler regained the NXT Women's title from Kairi Sane, Toni Storm beat Io Shirai to win the 2018 Mae Young Classic, Trish and Lita returned for a tag team match to defeat Mickie James and Alicia Fox, and in the main event, Ronda Rousey managed to get the better of Nikki Bella. Yes, this one was truly one for the books, as it was the first of its kind, something which we'll no doubt see more of in the future as the division continues to grow. And after this, on November 2nd, WWE had their second Saudi show of the year when they hosted Crown Jewel. Yes, it was here that we saw Shinsuke Nakamura defeat Rusev, Shane McMahon win a tournament to be crowned best in the world, Brock Lesnar beat Braun Strowman for the vacant Universal title, and Shawn Michaels is returned to the ring. That's right, in one of the most infamous matches in WWE history, DX and the Brothers of Destruction fumbled their way around the ring for almost half an hour, with Kane losing his mask and wig, and Triple H pick up an injury, leaving HBK to pick up the slack and wrestle most of the match by himself. And even though Shawn did put on a great performance here, all the other mishaps that happened has meant that this match has gone down as one of the wildest returns to the ring we've seen to this day. So thank goodness we had something a lot better only a couple of weeks later on November 17th then, when NXT gave us TakeOver War Games. And here we saw Aleister Black defeat Johnny Gargano, Tommaso Ciampa retain the brand's world title against Velveteen Dream, and the union of Pete Dunne, Ricochet, and the War Raiders overcome the Undisputed Era in the titular War Games match. And with this to live up to then, it was now up to the Red and Blue brands to put on a great show at Survivor Series. How would they do that? Well, by making some last-minute changes to the card in order to shake things up. Of course, some of these were intentional, such as Daniel Bryan turning heel to win the WWE title from AJ Styles on the prior episode of SmackDown. But others, meanwhile, well, they were unintentional, as was the case when, during the build to her showdown with Raw Women's Champion Ronda Rousey, Becky Lynch invaded the Red brand on the November 12th episode of Raw and got a legit concussion when Nia Jax punched her in the face, with this having a real butterfly effect on the course of wrestling history. So with Becky not being cleared to compete at Survivor Series then, it meant that Charlotte Flair would have to step in and take her place. Luckily for the man, however, this incident only served to get her even more over with fans than she had been before. And she wasn't the only one who was catching fire, because elsewhere on the card, the now heel WWE Champion Daniel Bryan felt completely reinvigorated when he stepped into the ring for a true dream match against Universal Champion Brock Lesnar. As for the rest of the card on that night though, well, it would mostly be made up of 5-on-5 elimination bouts, with little of note taking place. So it's just as well weekly TV was there to keep the mid-card moving heading into December, because there, after another special live Starrcade event on November 25th and a tribute to the Troop show on December 4th, WWE held their final big show of the year, TLC, Tables, Ladders and Chairs, on December 16th. And the mid-card would be a big focus of this one, as it turned out, because not only was The Bar having a classic against The New Day and the Usos over the SmackDown Tag Team titles, but Carmella and R-Truth were getting some shine when in the finals of the Mixed Match Challenge, they faced off against and ultimately defeated Alicia Fox and Jinder Mahal. But that wasn't all which was going on here, because after Braun Strowman won a ladder match to earn a shot at Brock Lesnar's Universal title, and Rey Mysterio made his return to WWE with a win over Randy Orton, the Planet's champion Daniel Bryan was able to retain his new customized hemp belt over AJ Styles in their big-time rematch. Of course, not everything about this show was met with love by fans, though. No, quite the opposite, as the now medically cleared Becky Lynch lost her SmackDown Women's title to Asuka, something which came as a disappointment to many. However, little did fans know at the time, this was all leading to something even bigger and better for Becky, something nobody saw coming. That's right, we were about to head into a great time for WWE, and that's because, while there was a lot of good to come from 2018, 2019 was about to see the rise of not only the women's division to levels we've never seen before, but also an underdog champion that finally got his shot at the big time. 2019 was a huge year in pop culture, as not only did we have the grand finale of an 11-year saga when Avengers Endgame broke the box office, but we also saw the finale to Game of Thrones. Meanwhile, over in the world of wrestling, we saw women rise to heights we had never seen before, all while a longtime fan favorite underdog finally got his shot at the big time. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in the WWE in 2019, a year in review. When we last left off, Brock Lesnar was Universal Champion on Raw, Daniel Bryan was WWE champion over on SmackDown, and elsewhere on the same brand, Becky Lynch was undergoing a meteoric rise towards the main event scene. But before we deal with any of that in 2019, we first have to venture over to developmental, because after NXT UK held TakeOver Blackpool on January 12th, a show which saw Pete Dunne defend the United Kingdom title against Joe Coffey and Toni Storm defeat Rhea Ripley to become the new UK Women's Champion, it was back stateside. And that was because at TakeOver Phoenix on January 26th, not only would Tommaso Ciampa and Shayna Baszler successfully defend their men's and women's world titles against Aleister Black and Bianca Belair respectively, but Matt Riddle would move up the ladder with a win over Cassius Ohno. So this left the main roster with big shoes to fill the following night at the Royal Rumble then, and it appears they were well aware of this because, in the undercard of a packed show, The Miz and Shane McMahon won the SmackDown Tag Team titles from the Bar, all before Ronda Rousey fended off the challenge of Sasha Banks in the Raw Women's title bout. Then, following that, the two men's world titles were put on the line when Daniel Bryan got the better of AJ Styles, and Brock Lesnar did likewise with Finn Balor. But of course, neither of these bouts were what people had on their minds after the show, because in the real main events, Seth Rollins lasted for 43 minutes to win the men's rumble, and Becky Lynch finally got her due when she last eliminated Charlotte Flair to win the women's. And that then meant the only question left was, who would she choose to challenge at WrestleMania? Well, as it happened, fans wouldn't have to wait long to find this out, because the very next night on Raw, Lynch came out to confront Ronda Rousey and stake her claim at the belt. Yes, it was the match everyone wanted after having been robbed of it the November prior. But before this story could develop any further, it was back to NXT, as on February 2nd, the Worlds Collide show pitted the Black and Gold brand, their UK counterpart, and 205 Live against each other in a tournament which was eventually won by the Velveteen Dream when he beat Tyler Bate in the finals. And with that now over, things could return to the main roster where, on February 17th, they held Elimination Chamber. And here, two major moments occurred, as not only did Sasha Banks and Bayley become the inaugural Women's Tag Team Champions, but Kofi Mania was born. Why was Kofi Kingston so popular all of a sudden? Well, in the main event WWE title match held inside of the titular chamber, it was originally supposed to be Daniel Bryan defending against AJ Styles, Randy Orton, Jeff Hardy, Samoa Joe, and Mustafa Ali. That said, once Ali got a legit injury days prior to the bout, it meant Kofi would have to be subbed in as a last-minute replacement instead. And what a great decision this turned out to be, because it was here the New Day member put on an absolutely star-making performance, one so good that come the end of it, Vince McMahon was forced to change his WrestleMania plans. That's right, despite losing the bout, Kofi got so over during it that the original WWE title match at the Showcase of the Immortals between Bryan and Kevin Owens was scrapped, with Kingston being inserted as the new challenger instead. And he wasn't the only one being inserted into a title match at the last minute, as over on Raw, following Becky Lynch's kayfabe knee injury, she was removed from the planned Ronda Rousey contest and instead replaced with Charlotte Flair. Not that the man was ready to go down so easy though. No, in one last gasp attempt to re-secure her spot, she'd challenge the Queen at March 10th's Fastlane, with the stipulation being that if she could win, then the whole thing would become a triple threat. And win she most certainly did here, though not without a little help from Rousey herself, of course. But why would the baddest woman on the planet want to add Lynch to the match? Well, because she still had unfinished business with her. Elsewhere on the card, meanwhile, the Boss and Hug Connection defended their women's tag team titles against Nia Jax and Tamina. The Miz and Shane McMahon came to blows after losing the SmackDown tag team titles to the Usos, and following his return to action, the now cancer-free Roman Reigns reunited with Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins to take on Drew McIntyre, Bobby Lashley, and Baron Corbin. Unfortunately, though, this would be the last time Ambrose appeared on a WWE pay-per-view because, as a result of him neglecting to sign a new contract, he'd be gone by the time the summer came around. Still, at least the Shield would continue to dominate Raw for a while, all while over on SmackDown, Kofi Kingston was completing his set of trials in order to make sure he got his shot at the American Dragon. And that would lead us into WrestleMania weekend, a weekend which started off strong when on April 5th, TakeOver New York took place. Yes, this one didn't go as originally planned, as it was supposed to first see the blow-off to the Johnny Gargano-Tommaso Ciampa feud following Gargano's return to the side of light. But that wasn't meant to be in the end, because in the days leading up to the show, the Blackheart picked up a serious neck injury and so had to vacate the NXT World title. So at the last minute, Adam Cole was added to the mix as both he and Johnny Wrestling battled it out over the now vacant title. And this ended up being a blessing in disguise because the two had one of the best matches of the year here, a match which ended up with the babyface finally getting the big win. Elsewhere on the show, meanwhile, not only would Aleister Black and Ricochet get a proper NXT standoff when they were defeated by the War Raiders, but Walter would end Pete Dunne's 685-day reign as United Kingdom champion after a chop-heavy war. Yes, it was a hell of a show, and this momentum would continue on into the next night too, as new Hall of Fame inductees D-Generation X, the Honky Tonk Man, and Tori Wilson all got their moments in the spotlight. Then the night after this, it was time for the grand finale as a mammoth 7-hour-long WrestleMania 35 started off with Seth Rollins making short work of Brock Lesnar to become the new Universal Champion. Following that, the Usos finally got a main card WrestleMania spot, Shane McMahon beat The Miz in a Falls Count Anywhere match, and the Iconics shocked the world by defeating the Boss and Hug Connection, Nia Jackson Tamina, and Beth Phoenix and Natalya to become the new Women's Tag Team Champions. But that was far from the end of the night because next, arguably the emotional highlight took place when the power of Kofi Mania overcame the odds as Kofi Kingston pinned Daniel Bryan to win the WWE title. And while this would have been enough for one WrestleMania alone, it still didn't stop things from carrying on for a while yet, as once Roman Reigns beat Drew McIntyre and Triple H gave Batista the retirement match he'd been craving for years, Baron Corbin formally put Kurt Angle out to pasture. Then, Finn Balor won the Intercontinental title from Bobby Lashley, all before the main event took stage when, for the first time ever, the women headlined the biggest show of the year. Yes, many at the time wanted to see a one-on-one match between the biggest babyface in the company, Becky Lynch, and the biggest mainstream star, Ronda Rousey, but after winning the SmackDown Women's title in the weeks leading up to the show, Charlotte Flair entered the mix too. Not that it mattered much in the end though, because once it was over, the man got the pinfall over Rousey to become both the Raw and SmackDown Women's Champion in a moment which echoed the big Daniel Bryan win from 5 years prior. And it's just as well this happened because with the company now losing the Shield, they needed a big-time moment to carry them through the rest of the spring. That's right, time had finally come up on Dean Ambrose's contract, and so, after a special The Shield's Final Chapter show on April 21st, he'd exit stage right. And this all led us into Money in the Bank on May 19th, a show where Kofi Kingston and Seth Rollins both managed to keep hold of their men's world titles against Kevin Owens and AJ Styles, respectively. As for Becky Lynch, however, well, she'd only get half lucky. As well, she did successfully defend her Raw Women's title against Lacey Evans, she would lose her SmackDown one to Charlotte Flair. That said, Flair's reign proved to be short-lived too because after winning the Women's Money in the Bank contract earlier in the night, Bayley would cash in here and take the title home for herself. Meanwhile, in the men's Money in the Bank ladder match, it was Brock Lesnar who came out on top, with this giving him a title shot anytime he chose to cash it in. And while he was weighing up his options then, over on NXT, the developmental brand was preparing for June 1st's TakeOver 25, a show which, when it eventually came, saw the Velveteen Dream win a North American title match against Tyler Breeze, Shayna Baszler submit Io Shirai in the women's title bout, and Adam Cole finally reached the top of the mountain himself when he beat Johnny Gargano to become the new NXT World Champion. And after this, we saw WWE Super Showdown live from Jeddah, with this card giving us Randy Orton versus Triple H, Shane McMahon versus Roman Reigns, and Goldberg almost permanently end The Undertaker when he executed a botched jackknife powerbomb on him. Still, at least things got better once the company returned home, as at June 23rd's Stomping Grounds, Roman got a win over Drew McIntyre, Kofi Kingston racked up another title defense over Dolph Ziggler, Bayley defeated Alexa Bliss, Becky Lynch defeated Lacey Evans, and in the main event, Seth Rollins retained his Universal title in a match against Baron Corbin, where Lacey Evans was the special guest referee. Then on July 14th's Extreme Rules, we saw Becky and her real-life fiancé Seth Rollins take on both Lacey and Baron Corbin in a mixed tag team match, in a show that also gave us Kofi Kingston get a big win over Samoa Joe, the Revival retain their Raw tag team titles against the Usos, The Undertaker have his last ever live in-ring match when he teamed with Roman Reigns to beat Shane McMahon and Drew McIntyre, and Brock Lesnar end the night by successfully cashing in his Money in the Bank contract on the Architect to become the new Universal Champion. That's right, Brock was back on top again whether fans liked it or not. But while this was divisive, something most fans could agree was great was the series of Firefly Funhouse segments Bray Wyatt had been putting out over on Raw as he gradually began teasing the arrival of a terrifying new incarnation. Before this incarnation would be revealed, however, a SmackDown special entitled Smackville took place in Nashville on July 27th and saw Shinsuke Nakamura defend his Intercontinental title against Mustafa Ali and Kevin Owens make short work of Elias. Then, once that was out of the way, it was onwards to SummerSlam weekend where, before the big show itself came around, NXT held TakeOver Toronto on August 10th. And on this show, not only did a newly heel Io Shirai show everyone how it was done when she beat Candice LeRae, but 4 titles would be successfully defended when the Street Profits beat the Undisputed Era, the Velveteen Dream got the better of Pete Dunne and Roderick Strong, Shayna Baszler tapped out Mia Yim, and in a 2 out of 3 falls encounter, Adam Cole bested Johnny Gargano by a score of 2-1. Could the main roster live up to this? Well, we'd find out the following evening, as in front of a packed crowd at the Scotiabank Arena, things started off strong when Becky Lynch retained her Raw Women's title during a hard-fought battle against Natalya. After that, Goldberg attempted to recover from his poor showing in Saudi with a quick win over Dolph Ziggler, and Bayley defeated Ember Moon to keep hold of her SmackDown Women's title. But that wasn't even close to the highlight of the night, as once Kevin Owens got a win over Shane McMahon, Trish Stratus made her return to the ring in order to put on a great match against Charlotte Flair, with this maybe even being Trish's greatest ever in-ring performance. And when this was over, in the first of 3 main events, Kofi Kingston successfully slayed the Dragon of Randy Orton in order to keep the WWE title around his waist, and in his in-ring debut, Bray Wyatt's new incarnation, The Fiend, stole the show when he demolished Finn Balor and sent him packing back to NXT. Then following that, the show's closer saw Seth Rollins regain the Universal title from Brock Lesnar in a great match that lasted just over 13 minutes. And this win painted a target on Seth's back again going forward because over the next few weeks, Braun Strowman would emerge as the next challenger to the Architect's crown. Of course, Rollins and Strowman wouldn't face off against each other quite yet, though. No, while they were busy winning the tag team titles together over on Raw, in NXT UK, TakeOver Cardiff was taking place on August 31st. And there, after Cesaro and Ilya Dragunov had a fantastic showing, and Walter put on a match of the year contender against Tyler Bate, 2 new champions would be crowned when Mark Andrews and Flash Morgan Webster won the tag team belts. Then, Kaylee Ray beat Toni Storm to become women's champ. And after this, we saw the Clash of Champions pay-per-view on September 15th. With the main event here being Seth Rollins versus Braun Strowman for the Universal title, where the champ retained, and the undercard giving us some great matches as we saw Bayley get the win over Charlotte Flair during the SmackDown Women's title match, and a newly heel Sasha Banks do the same over Becky Lynch in the Raw one. That said, as this latter victory happened via disqualification, the man kept her title, just as Shinsuke Nakamura did when he put his Intercontinental belt up for grabs against The Miz. And the same could be said for Alexa Bliss and Nikki Cross too when they defended their women's tag team titles against Mandy Rose and Sonya Deville. As for the SmackDown Tag Team titles, however, well, the incoming champs wouldn't fare as well because, after a 10-minute war, the New Day ended up losing to the Revival. And that would only be the beginning of the stable's woes as it happened because, just a few weeks later, on October 4th's 20th anniversary episode of SmackDown, Kofi Mania came to a crushing end in the worst way possible when Kofi Kingston was defeated by Brock Lesnar in just 8 seconds. And this sense of fan frustration would build even further when, at October 6th's Hell in a Cell pay-per-view, Bray Wyatt would take on Seth Rollins in what many of the audience were calling the worst Cell match of all time. But at least it wasn't all bad here. No, in the undercard things fared better as there, not only did Becky Lynch and Sasha Banks have a banger inside of the cage, but Daniel Bryan cemented his new face turn by teaming up with Roman Reigns to take on Luke Harper and Eric Rowan. But as the American Dragon was shifting to the side of the good guys once more, over on Raw, Bayley was going in the opposite direction. And that's because after choosing to align herself with her old friend Sasha Banks again, she suddenly found herself a heel for the first time. Of course, this was a good thing in the long run though, because it allowed her to shake things up right when she needed to the most. It's just a shame she wouldn't get to show what she could do at the next big show of the year then, because even if the women were going to have a match in Saudi for the first time at October 31st's Crown Jewel, the role model wouldn't be involved in this. No, instead that honor would go to Lacey Evans and Natalya in a history-making moment. Elsewhere on that card, Brock Lesnar beat UFC star Cain Velasquez in a one-shot appearance, Mansoor got a hometown win over Cesaro, Tyson Fury scored a victory during his boxer versus wrestler match against Braun Strowman, and in the main event, The Fiend ended Seth Rollins' 81-day reign with the Universal title. After the show, however, the big story wasn't that there was a new champion. No, it was that the plane carrying most of the wrestlers back to America for SmackDown would be delayed. And this meant that due to the roster being severely depleted, SmackDown would see a huge number of NXT superstars get called up en masse for one night only, with this episode giving us some great action, including matches like Tommaso Ciampa vs. The Miz, Rhea Ripley and Tegan Nox vs. Fire and Desire, and the NXT champion Adam Cole defeating Daniel Bryan in the main event of the show. And luckily, this would play well into the next pay-per-view because with Survivor Series coming up on November 24th, it was all about brand supremacy. So after TakeOver War Games took place on the 23rd and saw not only Team Ripley stand victorious over Team Baszler, but Team Ciampa get the win over the Undisputed Era in the 2 titular cage matches, the next night, Survivor Series saw the Black and Gold brand be put over great as North American Champion Roderick Strong scored a victory over US Champion AJ Styles and Intercontinental Champion Shinsuke Nakamura. Then, in the main event, NXT Women's Champion Shayna Baszler put down both Raw Women's Champion Becky Lynch and SmackDown Women's Champion Bayley. Elsewhere, meanwhile, all 3 men's world titles were successfully defended when Adam Cole beat Pete Dunne, Brock Lesnar demolished Rey Mysterio, and The Fiend put an end to the threat of Daniel Bryan. But while that would be the last appearance of The Fiend on pay-per-view this year, it wouldn't be the last we'd see of Wyatt himself, as after another Starrcade special and a tribute to the Troops show, December 15th saw TLC, Tables, Ladders, and Chairs emanate live from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And there, after briefly reverting back to his Mr. Rogers-style children's television host persona, the Universal Champion beat The Miz in just under 7 minutes. Then, once that was done, Aleister Black left his dark room to face off against Buddy Murphy, Bobby Lashley and Rusev took their feud over Lana to pay-per-view, and Roman Reigns ate his last loss in years at the hands of Baron Corbin. Then over on NXT on December 18th, Rhea Ripley would dethrone Shayna Baszler to win the brand's women's title in a moment that helped take her career to the next level. That's right, this was the first major sign that Rhea was going to be a major player in WWE and someone to keep an eye on for the following decade. Yes, things were certainly looking up for the future of WWE. After all, not only was the main roster looking strong with some great main event talent, but NXT was giving us the stars of tomorrow. Little did we know at the time, though, things were about to be shaken up in a major way the very next year.